The year was 1917, and Russia stood on the edge of something it could not yet name. The old empire, once gilded and immense, had begun to crack. In the palaces of Petrograd, the chandeliers still shone, but their light trembled over rooms filled with fear. In the frozen trenches along the Eastern Front, men fought and died for a czar who no longer believed in victory. Bread lines stretched through the capital, the air thick with whispers of mutiny, of hunger, of change. And then, the whispers became a roar. The Romanov dynasty, 300 years of divine rule, collapsed under the weight of war, poverty, and rage. The czar abdicated, leaving behind an empire adrift, a ship without a captain in a sea of revolution. For a fleeting moment, hope flickered. Workers' councils, the Soviets, rose in the streets. The people dreamed of peace, of land, of dignity. But revolutions, once born, have lives of their own. In the shadows of that broken throne, rival visions took shape, fierce, uncompromising, and destined to collide. One promised order and tradition, the other, equality and the future. Between them lay the heart of Russia, bleeding, starving, and searching for salvation. From the snows of Siberia to the shores of the Black Sea, the nation was torn apart. Armies formed not only of soldiers, but of peasants, intellectuals, and dreamers. Red banners fluttered against white uniforms. Cities were taken and retaken, villages burned and families shattered. It was a war that devoured its own children, where brother fought brother, and the line between justice and vengeance disappeared beneath the smoke. Foreign powers landed troops on Russian soil, each with their own motives to contain the revolution, to reclaim debts, to redraw a world reshaped by war. An entire empire dissolved into fragments of chaos, and amid that storm rose new names. Lenin, the architect of revolution; Trotsky, the man on the armored train who forged an army out of ashes; Denikin, Kolchak, and Wrangel white commanders clinging to the ghosts of a vanished order. But this was more than a civil war. It was the death of one world and the birth of another. Out of famine and fear, a new kind of state began to form, not of emperors and nobles, but of ideology, iron, and discipline. The Bolsheviks would claim victory, but at what cost? Could the dream of equality survive the terror it unleashed? Could freedom survive the will to control it? Tonight, we journey through the darkness of those years, through the battles, betrayals, and the quiet courage of millions who lived and died in a land remade by fire. This is the story of the Russian Civil War, the war that changed the world, and the war that Russia has never truly escaped. You are watching Lullaby of Empires, The Last Tsar and the Breaking Empire. In the fading light of the Romanov world, Russia breathed unevenly, a tired giant standing on trembling legs, whispering through the snow. For 3 centuries, the Romanov dynasty had ruled a land so vast that the sun could not rise and set upon it at once. From the frozen Arctic to the heat of the Black Sea, it stretched like a kingdom of eternity. Yet by the dawn of the 20th century, that eternity had begun to crack. Beneath the glittering halls of St. Petersburg, the marble floors still echoed with the soft steps of courtiers and soldiers, but the walls hid a restless silence, a silence that always comes before the storm. Tsar Nicholas II, the last of his line, was a man of deep faith but uncertain will. To his family he was gentle, almost shy, a father who preferred quiet evenings and the laughter of his children to the heavy demands of empire. But to his people he became a distant shadow, an emperor wrapped in ceremony while the world around him shifted and darkened. His portrait still hung in schools and post offices, his profile stamped on coins that circulated from Warsaw to Vladivostok, yet loyalty had begun to turn brittle. Industrial smoke rose over the cities, mingling with the prayers of a peasantry that still toiled as their ancestors had under serfdom. Factories throbbed with machines brought from the west, but their workers earned starvation wages. Railways stretched across the tundra, but in the countryside, famine still haunted families like an old, unwelcome ghost. Russia was a contradiction wrapped in snow. ancient yet desperate to be modern, proud yet humiliated by its own poverty. The empire's nobles danced in crystal ballrooms while villages went dark each winter, their lamps dimmed for lack of oil. And in those dark huts, whispered conversations grew dangerous. Words like justice, equality, and change began to move from mouths to minds. Then came 1905, the first crack of thunder. In January, a procession of unarmed workers marched toward the Winter Palace carrying icons and petitions, believing their little Argratter father would hear their pleas. They asked not for rebellion but for bread. But the palace guards opened fire. The snow turned red that day. The massacre became known as Bloody Sunday, and though the Tsar claimed he never ordered it, his people stopped believing. The myth of divine authority began to crumble. Across the empire, strikes flared, mutinies spread through the navy, and villages rose in protest. For a moment, it seemed the old order might dissolve, but Nicholas survived by promising reforms. A parliament, the Duma, was born, but it was a child chained to the throne. Every law required the Tsar's blessing, and when the Duma grew bold, he dissolved it like a magician vanishing smoke. For the next decade, Russia lived in uneasy silence. The empire's wounds were bandaged, not healed. In quiet drawing rooms, revolutionaries plotted beneath the watchful eyes of secret police. Exiles wrote manifestos in Switzerland and Siberia, dreaming of a future unruled by kings. One of those exiles, a man named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to history as Lenin, waited patiently, like frost, waiting for the river to break. But it was not the revolutionaries who struck the first fatal blow. It was the Tsar himself and the world he tried to command. When 1914 arrived, the guns of Europe thundered. The First World War swept across borders with an iron hunger. At first, Russia rallied. Patriotic songs echoed through the streets. Men marched under banners of the double-headed eagle, convinced that God and the Tsar would lead them to glory. But the glory never came. The front collapsed into mud and misery. Millions of peasants were pulled from their fields to fight in a war they did not understand. They froze in trenches without boots, fired rifles without bullets, and bled for generals who read outdated maps. Trains meant to carry food to the front returned filled with corpses. By 1916, entire villages had no men left to harvest crops. The cities starved, while soldiers died whispering prayers to a heaven that no longer answered. In the Winter Palace, the Tsar's advisors begged him to step aside, to let his ministers govern, but Nicholas clung to power not from arrogance alone, but from belief. He believed that monarchy was sacred, that to abandon it was to betray Russia's soul. When disaster struck the army, he made a fateful choice. He took personal command at the front, leaving the capital in the hands of his wife, Alexandra. Alexandra was devoted but isolated, mistrusted by the nobility, and despised by the public, partly for her German birth. In her desperation, she turned to a wandering mystic, Grigory Rasputin, a man whose piercing eyes and strange prayers seemed to soothe her ailing son, the young heir, Alexei. Rasputin's influence grew until it reached every corner of the court, corrupting ministers and scandalizing society. Rumors whispered that the Tsarina's faith in the man from Siberia was destroying the empire from within. By 1917, the pressure became unbearable. The army was broken, the treasury empty, the people starving. Bread riots ignited in Petrograd, first women demanding food, then workers joining, then soldiers refusing orders to fire on the crowds. In a matter of days, the capital dissolved into revolution. Nicholas tried to return from the front, but his train was halted by mutinous soldiers. Surrounded, isolated, and powerless, he abdicated the throne in March 1917, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. There was no final battle, no thunder of cannons, only the quiet signing of a document and the whisper of history turning its page. The monarchy was gone, and with it, the fragile illusion of stability. The Tsar and his family were taken into custody, first treated with respect, then with suspicion, and finally with fear. They became prisoners of the revolution they could not comprehend. Russia's new leaders, a patchwork of liberals, socialists, and moderates, formed a provisional government, promising democracy and reform. For a brief moment, the air was filled with speeches, newspapers, and hope. But beneath that hope, another force stirred the councils of workers and soldiers, the Soviets, where the language of moderation gave way to the fire of ideology. In those restless summer months, the empire began to dissolve like snow under spring rain. The army disintegrated, desertion spread like fever, peasants seized land from landlords. In the streets, red banners fluttered beside the old tricolor, symbols of a nation divided against itself. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, tried to hold the center. He spoke of unity, of freedom, of keeping faith with the Allies in the war abroad. But his words could not fill empty stomachs. Each passing week eroded his authority. The Soviets gained strength, their slogans grew louder, and among them, whispering like a returning storm, was the voice of Lenin. Lenin returned to Russia that April, traveling in a sealed train through Germany, a journey that would change the world. When he arrived at Finland Station, he stepped onto the platform not as an exile but as a prophet. His message was simple, intoxicating, and absolute: peace, land, and bread. He promised to end the war, to give the land to those who worked it, and to place power in the hands of the Soviets. For a people weary of lies and hunger, it sounded like salvation. For his opponents, it was madness. By autumn 1917, Petrograd simmered like a pot left unattended. The government staggered from one crisis to another, its ministers arguing while soldiers and workers armed themselves. On an October night, under cold rain and whispering wind, the Bolsheviks made their move. They stormed the Winter Palace not in a grand battle, but almost quietly. The defenders surrendered after brief resistance. By morning, the red flag flew over the palace where Nicholas once ruled. Power had changed hands not to the people, but to a party claiming to speak for them. The Tsar, meanwhile, sat hundreds of miles away under guard, writing letters to his children, signing them Papa. He spoke of faith and patience, still believing that perhaps someday he might return to his throne. But history had already closed that door. In 1918, the family was moved to the Ural Mountains, to a house called the Ipatiev House, the House of Special Purpose. There, on a July night, they were awakened by guards and told they were being relocated for safety. Instead, they were led to a basement. What happened next ended not only a dynasty, but an entire era. The Romanovs were executed swiftly, their bodies buried in secret. The empire that had crowned them in gold now buried them in silence. Across Russia, churches tolled uncertain bells. The news spread slowly, then not at all. The new government spoke of justice, but the nation mourned in whispers. And in that silence, a new kind of power took root, a power of ideas, of slogans, of fear. The dream of equality would soon clash with the ghosts of empire. The Reds and Whites would rise, each claiming to fight for Russia's soul. The Tsar's death was not an ending, it was the ignition of a greater fire. The empire had fallen asleep, but its dreams would burn for years to come. A revolution that devoured itself, the empire was gone, but the dust of its fall still hung in the air. Across Russia, from Petrograd to the smallest peasant village, people spoke of freedom as if it were a living thing, fragile, new, and untested. For centuries, they had been told what to believe, when to kneel, and whom to obey. Now, in the spring of 1917, no one knew who ruled them, or what the next sunrise might bring. The Tsar's train had stopped forever, and in its place rolled the uncertain wheels of revolution. At first, the streets of Petrograd felt alive with a strange optimism. Workers poured out of factories to celebrate the end of monarchy. Soldiers tore off the emblems of the Tsar from their uniforms and pinned red ribbons to their chests. Newspapers shouted of a new dawn, a government of the people, for the people. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though Russia had awakened into democracy, messy, chaotic, but full of promise. Alexander Kerensky, the eloquent lawyer turned politician, emerged as the revolution's hopeful face. He was young, theatrical, a man who believed words could bind together a country crumbling under the weight of war and hunger. But revolutions are not held together by speeches alone. Beneath the cheers, something darker stirred. The empire had been a vast machine, and now the gears were spinning without direction. The army that once obeyed the Tsar no longer obeyed anyone. Officers found their orders questioned by the very soldiers they commanded. Peasants who had prayed for freedom began seizing the land from their landlords, taking plows, horses, and grain, as payment for centuries of servitude. Across the cities, the price of bread rose faster than hope. The war, that endless bleeding wound, still raged, and every day brought new funerals, new hunger, new doubt. In the swirl of confusion, new powers began to rise. The Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers, formed in factories, barracks, and village halls. They claimed to speak for the common man, to represent the true voice of the people. In their meetings, fiery speeches mixed with cigarette smoke and restless applause. Among them, a familiar whisper returned the name of a man who had once been an exile in a foreign land. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin had come home. He returned in April, traveling across Europe in a sealed train provided by Germany, whose leaders believed his revolution would weaken their Russian enemy. When he stepped off the train at Finland Station, the crowd that met him saw a short, intense man with eyes that burned like cold fire. His voice was sharp, his gestures precise. He wasted no time with pleasantries. No support for the provisional government, he declared. All power to the Soviets. The crowd erupted in applause and disbelief. For the moderates who had hoped to build a parliamentary democracy, it was heresy. For the workers and soldiers who were tired of speeches, it was revelation. Lenin's vision was terrifyingly simple. He promised peace to the soldiers dying at the front, land to the peasants starving in the fields, and bread to the hungry in the cities. But his peace meant surrender, his land meant confiscation, and his bread meant the end of every compromise. He believed that the revolution must be absolute, that the old world must be destroyed completely before a new one could be born. To many, it sounded like madness. To others, it sounded like salvation. Kerensky tried to hold the center, but the center was collapsing. He spoke of duty and unity while the army mutinied and the peasants burned the estates of the nobility. The provisional government's ministers wrote decrees no one obeyed, their orders dissolving in the air before reaching the countryside. Russia was beginning to split not just politically but spiritually. To one side stood those who dreamed of a free democratic republic. To the other stood the Bolsheviks, disciplined, ruthless, certain of their destiny. Between them lay the exhausted millions who wanted only to live. By the summer of 1917, the thin thread of stability snapped. Soldiers returned from the front lines, gaunt and angry, their faith in the government broken. They filled the streets, armed and restless, demanding that the war end and power pass to the Soviets. The demonstrations began peacefully, but swelled into riots. Crowds chanted Lenin's slogans, and some carried banners calling for the downfall of the provisional government. Gunfire cracked through the streets, panic spread, and for 3 days Petrograd was a city of ghosts and echoes. No order, no certainty, only fear. The uprising collapsed as quickly as it began. Its leaders were hunted, its participants arrested. Lenin fled into hiding, his image darkened by accusations of treason. For a moment, it seemed as though the Bolshevik threat had passed, but revolutions rarely fade quietly. In their desperation to survive, the moderates turned to the old guardians of the empire, the army. Kerensky placed his trust in General Lavr Kornilov, a proud soldier who saw the revolution as a disease that needed purging. Kornilov marched his troops toward Petrograd, intending to restore order by force. To many, it looked like salvation. To others, it smelled of dictatorship. Kerensky panicked, accusing Kornilov of plotting a coup. He turned to the one force still organized enough to resist the Soviets, and through them, the Bolsheviks. He armed their Red Guards, thinking he could control them. The move saved the government from Kornilov, but it doomed it in every other way. By handing rifles to Lenin's followers, Kerensky had armed the very men who would destroy him. When Lenin emerged from hiding, he found the tide had turned. The Bolsheviks were now seen as the defenders of the revolution, the ones who had stopped Kornilov's march. Their newspapers spread across the country, their slogans painted on walls, their discipline admired even by enemies. In the factories and barracks, the Soviets shifted steadily under their control. Power was slipping like sand through the fingers of the provisional government. As the autumn winds arrived, Petrograd grew tense once more. Bread was scarce, coal was gone, and the chill of hunger settled into the bones of the city. The soldiers at the front no longer fought the Germans, they fought despair. In the villages, the peasants ignored orders from the government entirely, living by their own laws, dividing land as they saw fit. Russia was no longer one nation, it was 1,000 desperate republics, each fending for itself. Lenin, watching from his hideout, sensed that history had opened its door. He returned to Petrograd under disguise and pressed his party to act. Some of his comrades hesitated. They wanted elections, legitimacy, time. But Lenin believed time was the enemy. History will not forgive delay, he said. We must seize power now. And so, on a cold October night, they did. The assault on the Winter Palace was almost anticlimactic. There was no grand battle, no thunder of cannons, only confusion and scattered shots. The provisional government sat in a glittering hall surrounded by portraits of tsars, unaware that the world outside had already shifted. Red Guards stormed the palace, disarmed the guards, and arrested the ministers. By dawn, the Bolsheviks had taken control of Petrograd. The revolution was no longer a dream, it was law. The new rulers wasted no time declaring a new order. Decrees flowed like ink. An end to the war, land to the peasants, factories to the workers. In the streets, the poor celebrated, believing at last their suffering would end. But power changes faster than hearts. The Bolsheviks had no experience governing a vast, ruined country. Their authority was met with rebellion from every corner, liberals, monarchists, socialists, and peasants alike. They had promised peace, yet war still raged. They had promised food, but famine deepened. They had promised freedom, but dissent became treason overnight. Kerensky fled, his government dissolved, his dream of a democratic Russia buried beneath the roar of revolution. Across the countryside, the red flag rose above town halls and rail depots, and with it came the machinery of a new power, the Cheka, the secret police, born to defend the revolution and destroy its enemies. The prisons filled again, this time not with tsarists, but with the revolution's own children, Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, anarchists, even peasants who refused to hand over their grain. The streets that once sang with hope now trembled with whispers. Neighbors vanished in the night. The fire that had been meant to cleanse was beginning to consume. In faraway corners of Russia, other forces gathered. Generals who had once fought for the Tsar now rallied soldiers under white banners, vowing to reclaim the homeland from the Red Terror. Foreign troops landed at ports in the north and east, promising to restore order. In Siberia, the Czechoslovak Legion seized trains and territory. What had begun as revolution was becoming something darker, a civil war of unimaginable scale. The year closed like a fist around the country's heart. The Tsar was dead, his family gone. And yet, their ghosts lingered in the minds of millions who still prayed before their portraits. The peasants who had fought for freedom now fought for survival. The soldiers who had dreamed of peace now faced a new enemy, their own countrymen. Russia had traded one master for another, and the revolution that had promised to free her was tightening its grip instead. As the winter winds howled through the shattered windows of Petrograd, Lenin's government sat in the Smolny Institute, drawing lines on maps, drafting plans, and speaking of a world reborn. But outside, the streets were filled with hunger, and the snow carried the silence of a people who had learned that every revolution devours its own children. The empire was dead, the monarchy gone, and yet, in the endless white of Russia's winter, the struggle had only begun. The Tsar had fallen, but Russia had not yet risen. The return of Lenin and the birth of the Reds. The snows were melting when the train came rumbling across Europe, a sealed carriage, its windows covered, its passengers forbidden to step onto foreign soil. Inside sat a man whose thoughts had lived for years in exile, burning brighter for being caged. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov Lenin, and as the iron wheels carried him east toward Petrograd, he scribbled notes feverishly, as if afraid the world would end before he could speak them aloud. The empire he had dreamed of destroying was already dying. All that remained was to give it its final push. Outside the train, Europe bled. The Great War had torn through nations like wildfire, leaving fields of crosses and empty villages in its wake. Russia had suffered more than most. Millions were dead, millions more maimed or missing. The Tsar was gone, the throne abandoned, but the war raged on, devouring lives faster than any revolution could replace them. To Lenin, this was no tragedy, it was opportunity. In the chaos of collapse, he saw the perfect soil for a new kind of power. When his train reached Finland Station on the evening of April 3, 16 by the Western calendar, crowds gathered despite the cold. Soldiers, workers, and students pressed forward, straining to glimpse the man whose words had traveled faster than any train. Lenin stepped down onto the platform, small, bald, intense. He did not wave, did not smile. He looked at the faces before him, tired, hungry, expectant, and raised his fist. No support for the provisional government, he declared. All power to the Soviets. The crowd erupted, not because they understood every word, but because he spoke with the certainty of someone who did not doubt himself. That night, Petrograd whispered his name. The government watched uneasily, uncertain whether to arrest him or ignore him. But Lenin did not wait. He moved through the city like a storm contained in human form, meeting, lecturing, writing, organizing. His energy was relentless. While other leaders hesitated, debating compromise, he saw only one path forward: the total transfer of power to the working class, enforced by the iron discipline of the party. Where others dreamed of reform, Lenin dreamed of revolution, perfected, swift, merciless, complete. In his tiny apartment, papers and pamphlets piled high, he wrote his April theses, the blueprint for the new world. They rejected every polite illusion of the moderates. The provisional government? Bourgeois deceit. The war? An imperialist slaughter to be ended immediately. The land? To the peasants, without compensation. The factories? To the workers. The banks? Nationalized. Every sentence struck like a hammer on an anvil, forging an idea harder than steel. Even his comrades recoiled at first. They called it madness, suicidal extremism. But madness, when spoken with conviction to a starving nation, can sound like truth. In the following weeks, Lenin transformed words into motion. The Bolsheviks began to reorganize no longer a scattered underground movement, but a disciplined machine. They printed leaflets by night, held secret councils by day, infiltrated the Soviets, and quietly took control of factory committees and soldiers' councils. Each meeting, each speech, drew new recruits, men and women, who saw in Lenin's certainty a bijou, reflection of their own desperation. Hope, even clothed in rage, is still hope. While Petrograd trembled with tension, the war continued to tear the country apart. The front lines collapsed into rivers of mud and despair. Soldiers deserted by the thousands, boarding freight trains or marching home through forests. They carried rifles, hunger, and the bitterness of betrayal. Many arrived in the cities expecting food and rest, only to find scarcity and slogans. In the chaos, order became a memory. Lenin understood that the army, broken, leaderless, angry, was both a danger and a gift. To win the revolution, he needed soldiers, not speeches. It was then that another figure stepped into history's spotlight: Leon Trotsky, the man who would give the revolution its sword. Trotsky had once been a rival of Lenin. a brilliant orator and organizer who distrusted authoritarian rule. But the tides of 1917 pulled them together. Where Lenin's power lay in vision, Trotsky's lay in command. He had a gift for shaping chaos into structure, for turning ragged mobs into disciplined forces. His eyes burned with the same intensity as Lenin's, but his words flowed like fire and music intertwined. He could speak to thousands and make each man feel chosen. By summer, the Bolsheviks were no longer a whisper, they were a force. The provisional government weakened daily, trapped between the Allies, demanding continued war, and the people demanding peace. The grain trains stopped coming, bread vanished from shelves, and the price of everything doubled within weeks. In the factories, the air was thick with soot and rumor. In the barracks, soldiers debated politics instead of obeying orders. Everywhere, someone was shouting, "When will it end?" Lenin knew the answer. It would end only when his revolution began. In July, impatience spilled into the streets. Tens of thousands marched with banners calling for all power to the Soviets. Many carried weapons, though no one knew exactly what they meant to do. What began as a demonstration swelled into a revolt. Shots were fired. Panic spread. Government troops opened fire on the crowds. For 3 days, Petrograd was a battlefield of confusion. The uprising collapsed, and the blame fell squarely on the Bolsheviks. Lenin went into hiding, shaving his beard, disguising himself, sleeping in barns and safe houses. The authorities called him a German agent, a traitor, a destroyer of Russia. Yet, even in exile, his presence grew larger. Every rumor of his return kept the city trembling. While he hid, the provisional government stumbled toward disaster. Kerensky, desperate for stability, appointed General Kornilov to restore order, and with him unleashed a new crisis. Kornilov believed Russia needed the firm hand of military rule. His troops began marching on Petrograd, intending to crush the Soviets and disarm the workers. To stop him, Kerensky armed the very Red Guards he had condemned weeks before. They built barricades, seized railways, and rallied the soldiers of the city. The coup collapsed before it began, and the Bolsheviks emerged as heroes, the saviors of the revolution. By the time Lenin returned in the autumn, their popularity had surged beyond control. He arrived quietly, disguised still, but his mind was ablaze. The time for patience was over. He argued that the government was finished, that waiting for elections would mean defeat. Some of his comrades hesitated, fearful of civil war. "History will not forgive delay," Lenin thundered. "We must seize power now." And so, on a gray October night, while rain drummed softly on the city's rooftops, they did. It began almost invisibly. Red Guards slipped through the fog, occupying telegraph offices, bridges, and railway stations. The cruiser Aurora, anchored on the Neva, trained its guns toward the Winter Palace, where Kerensky's ministers huddled in confusion. When the signal came, a single blank shot, the revolution moved. Units of soldiers advanced through the streets, their boots splashing in puddles, their bayonets gleaming under weak lamps. By morning, the palace had fallen with barely a dozen casualties. Power changed hands not in a storm of blood, but in a quiet coup that would echo for a century. Lenin stepped onto the stage of the Smolny Institute and proclaimed a new world. His voice carried through the vast hall. "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." Cheers filled the room. Outside, cannons thundered in celebration. The revolution had triumphed, or so it seemed. In the days that followed, the Bolsheviks issued decrees faster than anyone could read them. The land was nationalized, the banks seized, the war declared over. Workers took control of factories, peasants took possession of estates, soldiers deserted en masse. The newspapers called it liberation. The Western powers called it chaos. The truth was something in between. The old world had been destroyed, but the new one had not yet been born. Amid the euphoria, darker forces stirred. The opposition parties, Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, liberals, were silenced or arrested. The press was censored for the protection of the revolution. The Constituent Assembly, elected with great hope, was dissolved by force after meeting for a single day. Power now rested entirely in the hands of the Bolsheviks, and through them, in the will of one man. The peace Lenin promised came with a bitter taste. In early 1918, he signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, surrendering vast territories, Ukraine, the Baltics, parts of Poland, in exchange for an end to the war. Millions saw it as betrayal, the shaming of a nation that had already bled too much. To Lenin, it was strategy. "We must lose the hand to save the body," he said, but the cost was immense. The army dissolved, officers deserted, and in the empty spaces of the collapsing empire, new armies began to form, white banners rising against red. Meanwhile, famine deepened. The countryside starved, its grain requisitioned to feed the cities and the Red Army. Villages resisted, and resistance was punished. The Cheka, the new secret police, began its grim work arrests, executions, fear. The revolution that had promised freedom was learning the language of terror. Trotsky, now People's Commissar for War, set about building the Red Army from fragments of the old. He traveled in an armored train painted with slogans and red stars, crisscrossing the vast land, rallying men, enforcing discipline. Deserters were shot, officers re-educated or replaced. The train became a symbol, part church, part factory, part execution ground. To his followers, Trotsky was the embodiment of revolutionary will. To his enemies, he was its wrath made flesh. Under his command, the Red Army grew into a force of millions, united by ideology and fear alike. Lenin watched from Moscow, his new capital, as the world around him hardened. The revolution had survived its birth, but at a cost so heavy it seemed almost biblical. The factories that had once cheered now worked in silence, producing rifles instead of tools. The peasants who had dreamed of owning their land now surrendered their harvests at gunpoint. Freedom had been replaced by necessity, equality by control. Yet in the minds of the faithful, hope still glimmered, the belief that suffering was only the price of creation, that someday the pain would give way to paradise. In those long winters, when the nights stretched endlessly and the cities were dark except for the glow of propaganda posters, Lenin wrote of the future as though it were already certain. "We have taken heaven by storm," he told his comrades. But heaven, it turned out, was colder than anyone imagined. The man who had returned in triumph in 1917 would not live to see the world he built grow old. Within a few years, illness would bend his body, silence his voice, and hand his revolution to others whose hearts were made of iron. But in that moment, as the red banners fluttered above Moscow, as the cannons of the Red Army roared in victory parades, it seemed that Lenin had bent history to his will. The empire of the tsars was gone, buried under snow and blood. In its place stood something new, uncertain, immense, a nation that called itself the Union of Soviets, and a people who no longer prayed to kings but to ideas. The Reds were born not in peace, but in hunger and discipline, in sacrifice and unyielding faith. Their dream was vast enough to fill the horizon, their shadow long enough to darken it, and somewhere in the silence, after the speeches and the cheers, as smoke drifted above the frozen city, one could almost hear the quiet murmur of the land itself, weary, bewildered, wondering what freedom truly meant now that it had been won. The man had returned, the Reds had risen, and the revolution, having devoured the old world, had begun to feast upon itself. The fall of a dynasty, the rise of an idea. The Romanovs had vanished into the night, but the echo of their reign still lingered in the marble corridors of memory. The palaces they left behind stood like hollow shells, their chandeliers dimmed, their gardens untended, their portraits staring down at a world that no longer recognized them. The empire that once stretched across 11 time zones now lay in fragments, its people caught between nostalgia and necessity, between the ghost of the crown and the promise of the red flag. In the months following the October Revolution, Russia seemed suspended between centuries. In Petrograd, the snow was gray with soot, and the street lamps flickered over posters proclaiming a new age of equality. Workers marched in celebration beneath slogans written in hurried paint. Children learned new songs, their voices echoing through half-empty schools, yet behind every window, uncertainty waited like frost. The people had traded a monarch for an idea, and ideas, they soon learned, could demand as much devotion as any king. For centuries, the Tsar had been both ruler and symbol, the embodiment of divine will. To love Russia was to love the Tsar. To rebel against him was to rebel against God. But now, the revolution had replaced heaven with history. The word comrade took the place of subject, and faith was redirected toward the future. The banners of saints came down, portraits of Lenin went up. The revolution had not only overthrown a dynasty, it had reinvented belief itself. At first, the change felt intoxicating. Factories that had once rung with the orders of foremen now echoed with debates. Peasants wrote petitions demanding land, speaking with voices no one had cared to hear before. Newspapers, thick with the smell of ink, declared that the age of oppression had ended. In smoky halls, workers' committees passed resolutions about wages, hours, and the dignity of labor. It seemed as though every man and woman in Russia had been invited to rewrite history with their own hands. But even revolutions must eat, and Russia was starving. The war had drained her fields and emptied her barns. Trains broke down, factories stood silent for lack of coal. In the countryside, mothers boiled bark and weeds to quiet their children's hunger. The new government promised bread, but promises filled no stomachs. Lenin's decrees reached the villages on fading sheets of paper carried by messengers on weary horses, but they were met with suspicion. Peasants cared little for ideology. They wanted grain, salt, and peace. Meanwhile, in the cities, the fervor of the new order hardened into discipline. The Bolsheviks, once a faction among many, now ruled as the only voice that mattered. Their committees met behind closed doors. Dissenters were quietly removed. The Cheka, the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution, was born in secrecy and baptized in fear. It began with small offices, a few agents, a few cells, but its reach spread quickly. Soon, rumors carried more weight than evidence. A careless word could end a life. Neighbors learned to whisper, and even whispers became dangerous. The Romanovs' fall had unleashed not only hope, but vengeance. Across the land, monuments were torn down, titles stripped away, estates seized. Former nobles fled or hid in barns, their names changed, their jewels buried in the earth. Priests were dragged from altars, accused of serving tyranny. Churches were looted for gold to fund the revolution. Icons were replaced by portraits of workers raising hammers, by slogans painted on walls in dripping red letters. Where once the empire had worshipped the divine right of kings, now it bowed to the infallibility of class struggle. And yet, even in their downfall, the Romanovs refused to disappear completely. Stories of their captivity spread the Tsar's quiet dignity, the Empress's unwavering faith, the children's innocence. In a country where truth had become a weapon, rumor became a kind of comfort. People whispered that the family might be rescued, that the little boy Alexei would live, that the empire's bloodline would someday return. But in July 1918, those whispers died. In a cellar in Ekaterinburg, the last of the dynasty met their end. Gunfire, screams, silence. The new world had no room for old ghosts. The monarchy was finished. And with its death, the revolution no longer had an enemy to blame. From that moment, it began to turn inward. The old Russia had believed in obedience. The new one believed in purity. To doubt was betrayal. To question was sabotage. Lenin, who had once preached liberation, now spoke of vigilance and control. He believed that revolutions failed not because of their enemies but because of weakness within. The Bolsheviks called it discipline. Others called it fear. The same energy that had overthrown the Tsar was now directed toward maintaining the revolution at any cost. Still, among the people, belief burned brightly. In the smoky light of kerosene lamps, workers studied pamphlets on Marxism and dreamed of a world without hunger. Young women cut their hair short and joined literacy campaigns in distant villages. teaching children to read by tracing letters in the dust. Soldiers painted red stars on their helmets and spoke of a brotherhood that knew no class or title. For a moment, it seemed the revolution could still redeem its promise that the world's first workers' state might become a beacon for all who suffered. But outside the cities, the countryside was stirring with unrest. The peasants had expected land and freedom. What they received were requisitions and commands. Armed detachments arrived to seize grain for the army and the towns. Those who resisted were branded as enemies of the people. Villages burned, fields were left untended, and from these ashes, new rebels rose, the so-called Greens, peasants fighting for neither red nor white, only for the right to survive. Meanwhile, beyond Russia's borders, the world watched with fascination and fear. Foreign governments sent troops under the banner of assistance, British, French, American, Japanese, each with its own motives. They claimed to be protecting supply lines or rescuing prisoners of war, but in truth, they sought to strangle the revolution before it could spread. The Bolsheviks called it intervention. The whites called it salvation. In truth, it was both and neither. The foreign presence only deepened Russia's wounds, turning every skirmish into proof of conspiracy. The idea of revolution became inseparable from the idea of siege. Lenin's health was already failing, but his mind remained sharp, relentless. He spoke of history as if it were an equation, cold, precise, inevitable. He believed that suffering was temporary, that the pain of transformation was the price of progress. To him, the fall of the Romanovs was only the first step in the great unfolding of socialism. The old world, he said, had to be broken so completely that it could never return. Every policy, every execution, every famine was justified by that vision of inevitability. To his followers, he was a prophet. To his enemies, a tyrant. To the millions who simply tried to live between decrees, he was both. Trotsky, meanwhile, gave the revolution its rhythm and its army. His armored train became a moving fortress of ideology, carrying printing presses, telegraphs, and firing squads in equal measure. At every stop, he spoke to soldiers in the freezing air, his words cutting through fatigue like steel. He told them they were not merely fighting for land or for government, but for history itself, for a future that would judge them by their loyalty today. His speeches stirred hearts, but his methods chilled them. Deserters were executed. Hesitation was treason. Under Trotsky's command, the Red Army grew from fragments into an iron tide. It marched not only against the whites but against doubt itself. As months turned into years, the revolution began to resemble the empire it had destroyed, centralized, disciplined, unquestionable. The difference lay in symbols, not in structure. The Tsar had ruled by blood, the party ruled by belief. The Orthodox Church had once blessed the crown, now the new faith of Marxism blessed the state. Where icons once hung, red banners fluttered. Where the imperial eagle had spread its wings, now the hammer and sickle glowed against the sky. The people had not escaped authority, they had only renamed it. In the quiet hours of winter, when even the factories fell silent and the snow muffled the sound of footsteps, some wondered if this was what freedom had meant. They remembered the early days, the songs, the parades, the laughter of children waving red flags, and compared it to the present, ration lines, arrests, hunger, fear. But to speak such thoughts aloud was dangerous. The revolution had its own saints, now martyrs, who had died for the cause, and to doubt was to desecrate their memory. So people learned to dream quietly, to whisper prayers not to God, but to the possibility of tomorrow. Yet even as the human cost mounted, the revolution's ideas took on a life of their own. They spread beyond borders into Germany, Hungary, China, carried by pamphlets and exiles, by dreamers who saw in Russia's suffering a kind of rebirth. For every famine, there was a believer. For every prison, a poet. For every death, a promise that the sacrifice would not be in vain. The Bolsheviks called this faith historical necessity. Others called it tragedy. By 1921, the fire that had consumed the old world was burning low. Lenin, weary and sick, introduced the new economic policy, a reluctant retreat from pure communism, allowing small trade and private enterprise to return. To many, it felt like betrayal. To others, a breath of sanity. For a time, the markets reopened, the cities revived, and the famine eased. But beneath the surface, the machinery of control kept turning. The revolution had survived, but its soul was harder, colder, less human. When Lenin died a few years later, his body was embalmed and placed in a glass tomb, guarded by soldiers. Pilgrims came from across the vast Union to see him not as a man, but as a relic, a saint of the secular world. The Tsar had once ruled in the name of God. Lenin now ruled in death through memory. His words were sacred scripture, his portraits omnipresent. The dynasty had fallen, but the need for worship endured. Where once stood an empire of crowns and altars, there now rose an empire of slogans and statues. The revolution had promised to end oppression. Instead, it had replaced one kind of reverence with another. Yet it also gave birth to something undeniable, a vision that would shape the century, inspiring uprisings, movements, and wars. From the ruins of the Romanovs rose a new dynasty, not of blood, but of belief. Its palaces were party offices, its priests were commissars, its gospel written in ideology rather than scripture. It would endure for generations, sometimes glorious, often brutal, always certain of its destiny. And so, the dynasty truly did fall, but in its place rose an idea so vast, so consuming, that it would command more loyalty, more sacrifice, and more fear than any crown ever had. The empire had been reborn not of emperors, but of conviction, and the people, weary yet bound to its promise, marched into a new age with hope in their hearts and shadows at their heels. The Tsars were gone, but the throne remained, its occupant now invisible, its name, history. The white dream of a lost Russia. The snows returned with a vengeance that year, sweeping across the steppes like a ghost reclaiming its kingdom. The war was not yet done, though its banners had changed. The Tsar was dead, the empire broken, but the guns still thundered not against foreign armies now, but against brothers, neighbors, even fathers and sons. Out of the ashes of monarchy rose the armies of those who could not bear its loss, the ones who dreamed of Russia as it had been, not as it was becoming. They called themselves the Whites. In the beginning, their dream glimmered with purpose. It was not only the cause of nobles and generals, though they formed its spine, it was also the cause of men who feared the new world the Bolsheviks had promised, merchants stripped of their shops, priests driven from their churches, peasants punished for a prayer. They gathered wherever the red banners did not yet reach. In the far south, the frozen east, the northern ports, their flags were pale, their coats worn, but their hearts burned with the conviction that history had taken a wrong turn and must somehow be forced back onto its proper road. They had leaders, two men of old honor and impossible faith. In the south stood General Anton Denikin, tall, gaunt, severe, a soldier of the Tsar who believed that discipline could heal chaos. In Siberia ruled Admiral Alexander Kolchak, once a polar explorer, now proclaiming himself supreme ruler of Russia, his uniform heavy with frost and pride. And in the Crimea there was the youngest of them, General Pyotr Wrangel, the Black Baron, a man of aristocratic grace and pragmatic cruelty, who believed that if the soul of Russia could be saved at all, it would be saved by steel. Each led fragments of what had once been a single empire. Their banners bore the old double-headed eagle. Their anthems spoke of faith, fatherland, and Tsar. Yet beneath those symbols, unity was fragile. Monarchists dreamed of restoring Nicholas's heir. Liberals imagined a constitutional republic. Cossacks sought only independence. Between their camps lay mistrust, pride, and the unspoken realization that they were fighting not merely against the Reds, but against time itself. At first, fortune smiled on them. The Red Army was still young, still learning how to fight as one. The Whites swept forward, their cavalry cutting through thin defenses, their officers armed with memories of older wars. Denikin's columns marched northward toward Moscow through a sea of fields shimmering with dust and blood. villages greeted them with cautious relief. The Bolsheviks had taken grain and sons. The Whites promised restoration, order, peace. But promises are easy, and soon the White requisitioners came too, demanding food, horses, recruits. For the peasants, liberation was only another uniform at the door. In the cities, the Whites ruled as though the old world had never ended. In Omsk, Kolchak held court beneath chandeliers looted from a governor's mansion. His ministers wore starched collars and argued over constitutions, while the prisons filled with suspected Reds. In the south, Denikin's officers revived the habits of empire-polished boots, silver samovars, the language of rank and punishment. They hated Bolshevism, but they feared democracy almost as much. Their vision of Russia was a mirror turned backward, noble, orderly, obedient. And so the peasants, who had dreamed of land and freedom, began to drift away from them. To survive, the Whites needed allies, and allies came, though never freely. Foreign ships appeared in northern harbors and on the Black Sea. British and French soldiers unloaded crates of rifles, shells, canned meat, American officers advised. Japanese troops occupied Vladivostok. They called it intervention, a mission to restore stability. But to the Russians who watched strangers march through their towns, it felt like invasion all over again. Propaganda poured from red printing presses. The Whites are puppets of the foreigner, the Reds are Russia itself, and for every foreign boot print, another peasant picked up a rifle for the revolution. The war spread like winter, from the Baltic to the Urals, from the Don to the Pacific. Trains became fortresses, rumbling across endless plains, their guns mounted on flat cars, their walls plastered with posters of saints or slogans. Villages changed hands again and again, each time paying tribute in blood. The lines on the map were drawn not in ink, but in ash. No front was stable, no victory final. The Whites fought bravely, but courage alone could not feed armies. They had no single command, no shared plan. Kolchak's forces in Siberia pushed westward even as Denikin's advanced north, each expecting the other to triumph first. Their supply lines stretched thin, their soldiers barefoot and hungry. Disease did what bullets could not. Typhus, dysentery, frostbite, these became the true generals of the campaign. Whole regiments vanished into hospitals and mass graves. Still, they fought on, driven by something deeper than strategy, a kind of longing. In the tents of the officers, men spoke of the old Russia as if it were a beloved woman lost at sea. They remembered the glittering balls of St. Petersburg, the scent of lilacs in Yalta, the ringing of church bells on Easter morning. They imagined themselves her defenders, knights in exile fighting to win her back from the hands of madmen. Yet outside their tents, that Russia no longer existed. The peasants who once bowed to them now plowed confiscated estates. The workers who once polished their boots now shouted slogans against them. They were fighting for a ghost. In 1919, for a brief, feverish moment, it seemed they might succeed. Denikin's army captured Kharkov, then Kursk, then Oryol. The road to Moscow lay open. The Red Army faltered, its ranks thin, its officers exhausted. Trotsky himself raced to the front in his armored train, rallying deserters with the threat of death and the promise of redemption. "No step back," he shouted, and his men believed him. The Reds regrouped. New recruits poured in, armed with ideology and desperation. When winter came, it came for the Whites first. Denikin's lines collapsed under snow and hunger. His retreat southward became a rout. Villages once friendly turned hostile, blocking roads, stealing horses, refusing shelter. The soldiers trudged through blizzards, their coats in rags, their boots wrapped in cloth. Many froze where they fell, their rifles clutched like relics. Denikin himself, broken and silent, handed command to Wrangel and sailed away. The dream of a march on Moscow ended in a drift of snow. In the east, Kolchak's empire crumbled faster still. His harshness had bred hatred, and the peasants rose against him. The Czechoslovak Legion, once his allies, betrayed him to the Reds. Captured near Irkutsk, he was shot beside a frozen river. His body dropped into the ice. The self-proclaimed supreme ruler of Russia vanished beneath the current, and with him sank the last hope of restoring the empire by command alone. By 1920, only Wrangel remained proud, lean, relentless. From the rocky hills of Crimea, he forged what he called the last army of Russia. He disciplined his troops, reformed his ranks, tried to treat peasants justly. For a moment, even his enemies admired him. But the tide of history was against him. Trotsky's Red Army surrounded the peninsula like a tightening noose. The final battles were fought under a black flag, fluttering beside the white two colors of mourning. When defeat became certain, Wrangel ordered evacuation. The harbors of Sevastopol and Yalta filled with chaos soldiers, mothers, children, priests, all crowding the decks of ships that groaned under their weight. The sea was calm, uncaring, reflecting the fires of the city behind them. Some wept silently. Others sang the old anthem one last time. As the ships pulled away, the lights of Crimea faded into the mist. Behind them lay a country they would never see again. Ahead lay exile. They sailed to Constantinople, to Paris, to Shanghai. They called themselves émigrés, but in truth they were refugees, an entire class uprooted. They opened cafes where samovars steamed and violins played waltzes from home. They printed newspapers that mourned the lost empire and cursed the Reds. Their children grew up speaking foreign tongues, dreaming of a Russia that existed only in memory. For them, the white dream never died. It simply became a lullaby sung in exile. Inside Russia, however, that dream was buried beneath new banners. The Bolsheviks declared victory and began to rebuild on the bones of war. The whites who remained were hunted down, imprisoned, or shot. Monuments to their cause were erased. Their names vanished from textbooks. But memory is stubborn. In the whispers of old soldiers, in the secret prayers of widows, the idea of the White Russia endured not as politics, but as longing for something irretrievably pure, a time before chaos. Years later, in the calm after the storm, even their enemies would admit that the ground whites had fought with tragic courage. They had believed in an impossible Russia, a country untouched by revolution or hunger, guided by honor rather than ideology. But such a Russia had never truly existed. The peasants had been starving long before the Reds came, the soldiers disillusioned long before the Tsar fell. The white dream was beautiful because it was false, a memory of light that burned brighter the farther it receded. In the end, the whites lost not only the war, but the narrative. The victors wrote the songs, built the statues, renamed the cities. Yet history, like winter, preserves what it buries. Beneath the ice of propaganda, the outlines of that lost dream remained fragile, shimmering, like frost on glass. And sometimes, on quiet nights in Moscow or Petersburg, when the wind swept down from the steppes and rattled the old iron gates, people could almost hear the echo of hooves and the faint strains of a waltz from long ago, when Russia still believed in its own innocence. The Reds had claimed the land, but the Whites had claimed the memory, and memory, though powerless, endures longer than any flag. Thus ended the White Dream, not in victory, nor even in total defeat, but in exile, carried forever in the hearts of those who could not wake from the past. The man on the armored train, Trotsky, builds the Red Army. The war was far from over. Russia was no longer an empire, nor yet a union, but something raw and wounded, a vast expanse of hunger, smoke, and confusion. Trains still rolled endlessly across her breadth. But where once they carried passengers and goods, now they carried revolution itself. And among these rumbling steel beasts, one stood apart. It bore no name, only slogans in white letters scrawled across its sides. Death to the enemies of the people. Long live the Red Army. Inside, pacing through the dim light of oil lamps and cigarette smoke, was the man who would give that army its soul. His name was Leon Trotsky. Trotsky had the sharpness of a blade and the fire of a sermon. He was no soldier by training, no officer of the old regime, yet when he spoke, even hardened men fell silent. He believed the revolution could not survive without discipline, without an army forged not in comfort but conviction. Where Lenin dreamed in ideology, Trotsky built in iron. His task was impossible: to shape chaos into command, to teach a nation of starving peasants and weary deserters how to fight for an idea instead of a czar. He began with almost nothing. The Red Army in 1918 was more rumor than reality: fragments of militias, workers with rifles, sailors still drunk on victory. They had passion, but passion is a poor shield against bullets. The Whites advanced, foreign troops occupied the ports, and whole provinces slipped away. Russia, in those months, seemed to be unraveling faster than any revolution could mend her. And yet, Trotsky believed she could still be saved, not by mercy, but by order. His train became both throne and temple. Painted deep crimson, armored with plates of steel, it was a moving command post, part barracks, part printing press, part court of judgment. On board were telegraphs, typewriters, propaganda leaflets, even a library of revolutionary literature. When it pulled into a station, the people gathered as though a prophet had arrived. Trotsky would emerge in his leather coat and spectacles, his voice cutting through the wind. "Comrades," he would shout, "the fate of the revolution rides with you." He spoke not as a politician but as a preacher, promising not salvation but purpose. To fight under the red banner, he said, was not to serve a government, but history itself. He traveled thousands of miles that way, through snow and mud, across the wreckage of bridges and villages burned to ash. Wherever he went, discipline followed like a shadow. Desertion was treason, cowardice a crime. He shot those who fled and rewarded those who stood firm. He reinstated former czarist officers to command units, pairing them with political commissars to watch their loyalty. It was a strange marriage of old and new, noble-born colonels leading peasant soldiers, all bound by the same invisible chain: fear of failure. Trotsky believed that only fear could breed courage. "The army," he said, "is not a school of kindness." And yet, there was a terrible kind of faith in his cruelty. Soldiers who had once drifted aimlessly found a reason to stand, to march, to obey. The Red Army, once a collection of slogans, began to move like a machine. It was no longer the desperate crowd of revolutionaries it had been in 1917, but an institution of discipline and dread. Trotsky forged it in the furnace of necessity, hammering each man until he either hardened or broke. He called it loyalty, others called it terror, but to him the two were indistinguishable. Outside the armored train, the land burned. The Whites advanced from the south and the east, their banners fluttering like ghosts of the old empire. Foreign armies dug in along the coasts. Entire towns changed hands overnight. Villages were raided, their grain taken by whichever flag arrived first. Families fled with what little they could carry, leaving behind homes reduced to smoke. The air itself seemed heavy with loss. And through it all, the train thundered on, carrying Trotsky and his army of scribes, commissars, and executioners into the heart of the storm. He believed words could be as powerful as bullets. At every stop, he printed pamphlets by the thousands, appeals to the workers, manifestos to the soldiers, denunciations of the Whites and their foreign sponsors. He wrote with the rhythm of a man possessed, his sentences sharp and unyielding. To read them was to feel the heat of belief, the conviction that history itself had chosen sides. "The Red Army," he declared, "is the army of liberation. The White armies are the servants of landlords and capitalists." The message was simple, but it worked. In a country of hunger and ruin, simplicity was salvation. Many of his soldiers had never seen a map, never read a book, but they understood hunger, injustice, and betrayal. They knew what it meant to be ruled and what it meant to be used. And so they followed Trotsky, not because they loved him, but because he gave their suffering meaning. Under the red banners, their misery became mission, their deaths, sacrifice. For the first time, their pain belonged to something larger than themselves. There was music, too grim, defiant songs that rose from the trenches and the frozen fields. The Internationale echoed through the smoke of campfires, sung by men whose boots were worn to nothing. Between battles, they sang not of glory, but of endurance of the world they hoped to build when the killing was done. Trotsky heard those songs from his train and smiled thinly. He did not believe in peace, not yet. Peace, he thought, was the reward for victory. And victory required a nation willing to suffer more than its enemies. Sometimes he would stand on the platform of his train at night. Staring into the endless darkness of the steppe, the wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the scent of ash and snow. In those moments, he seemed carved from the same iron as the rails beneath his feet, unbending, relentless, driven by something deeper than ambition. He believed himself a servant of inevitability, a midwife of the future. If blood was the price of birth, then he would pay it without hesitation. And blood there was, more than anyone had imagined. The Red Army became a tide, sweeping through towns and villages, reclaiming lost ground. Behind it followed the Cheka, purging dissent, rooting out spies, punishing resistance. To surrender was not safety, it was often a sentence. Yet even those who feared them whispered that the Reds brought order where the Whites brought chaos. Trains ran again, factories reopened, grain convoys reached the starving cities. The revolution, once fragile and fractured, now moved with the rhythm of command. And at its center, still, was Trotsky, the man on the train, the voice that refused to quiet. His soldiers began to speak of him in half-mythic tones. Some said he never slept, that he wrote orders and speeches until dawn, his pen scratching like a bayonet across paper. Others claimed his train could appear anywhere, summoned by crisis itself, a phantom of steel and steam. Wherever it arrived, morale surged, and when it left fear behind. To be praised by Trotsky was honor. To be summoned without explanation was death. He demanded the impossible and received it. In a land where logistics were broken, he made supply lines appear. When food ran out, he ordered requisitioning. When men deserted, he ordered firing squads. His enemies called him a monster. His followers called him necessary. The truth was both. Without him, the revolution might have collapsed under its own chaos. With him, it became something far more formidable, a state that learned how to control not just armies, but the human spirit itself. By 1920, the tide had turned. The white armies were collapsing, their leaders fleeing into exile, their dreams fading like the smoke of their burning camps. The Red Army marched victorious through the ruins they had left behind. Cities welcomed them, not with parades, but with silence, the silence of exhaustion. The war had lasted too long. Victory felt indistinguishable from survival. Trotsky's train rolled through the reclaimed lands, its wheels screeching against rails warped by frost and blood. He stepped out to address his soldiers, not in triumph but in warning. "Comrades," he said, "we have conquered the enemy, but the harder task remains to conquer ourselves." His words hung in the cold air like breath. He knew the revolution had not ended. It had merely entered its next phase. Power, once seized, must be kept, and keeping it required vigilance sharper than any sword. In Moscow, Lenin praised him, though privately he feared him. Trotsky's brilliance was undeniable, but so was his pride. The two men had built the revolution together, yet they were already growing apart. Lenin ruled by ideology, Trotsky by momentum. One saw himself as architect, the other as engine, and between them, the state they had created began to solidify no longer a movement, but a machinery. When the Civil War finally dimmed, Trotsky's train was retired, its armor rusting in the depots, its slogans fading under dust. But the legend of it endured, a symbol of discipline, of terror, of the strange fusion of faith and fear that defined the new Russia. For years to come, veterans would speak of the sound of that train at night, the whistle that meant salvation or death, depending on which side of the tracks you stood. Trotsky himself would not stay long in the heart of power. The same revolution that had lifted him would turn, as revolutions always do, upon its brightest children. But in those years of fire and frost, his name was inseparable from victory. He had built an army out of hunger and conviction, out of chaos and cruelty, and through it had given the revolution its permanence. When he looked back later, from exile, he would write that the train was his rolling republic, his school of war and will. But for those who rode beneath its banners, it was something else, a steel cathedral moving through a land without mercy, where the gospel was survival and the priest carried a revolver. The war had made monsters of men and saints of slogans, and when the snow finally melted, when the smoke cleared and the last of the whites had fled across the seas, Trotsky's train stood still, at last silent, gleaming faintly in the dawn. The man who had commanded it stepped down, his boots striking the earth of a country reborn. Around him stretched the wreckage of victory, villages burned, fields barren, faces lined with hunger. But in the distance, the red banners fluttered in the rising sun. Against all odds, the revolution lived. Trotsky looked toward that horizon, and for a moment, even he seemed unsure whether what they had built was salvation or curse. The wind carried the faintest echo of his own words, "We are building a new world." Yet, in the quiet that followed, it was hard to tell whether the sound was hope or warning. The armored train had stopped, but the revolution rolled on. A land between armies, peasants, Greens, and anarchists. The great war of colors, red banners, white eagles, black flags, swept across Russia like a storm that never ended. But beneath those banners lived the millions who carried no flag at all, the peasants of the endless steppe, the men and women whose backs had bent beneath centuries of toil, who sowed in spring and prayed the soil would not betray them in autumn. They were the quiet pulse of the land, and through the chaos of revolution they became its most wounded heart. When the empire crumbled, the peasants dreamed simple dreams, not of ideology or history, but of earth. They wanted what their fathers had never owned the right to: the fields they tilled, the huts they built, the harvests they gathered. In 1917, when the Tsar's throne was pulled down and the decrees of revolution promised land to those who work it, they believed the time had finally come. In the villages of Tambov, Smolensk, Saratov, people cut the imperial seals from the ledgers, divided the estates, and plowed under the fences that had once marked noble boundaries. For a moment the countryside breathed, free at last. But revolutions are greedy things. The armies of the Reds needed grain, the Whites demanded allegiance, the Greens were born out of resistance to both. From every direction came requisition squads, riding through villages with rifles across their backs and official papers in their hands. They spoke the language of necessity, for the front, for the revolution, for Russia. Yet the barns they emptied were the peasants' winter larders, the seed for the next year's sowing. Each confiscated sack of wheat meant another family that would starve. Anger grew quietly, like weeds between rows of dying crops. In some places, the peasants resisted with silence, hiding their grain in pits and burying their tools. In others, the silence broke into rage. Villages armed themselves with hunting rifles, scythes, and whatever weapons the collapsing armies left behind. They called their gatherings peasant committees, but soon they became militias. They swore no oath to Lenin or to Wrangel. Their loyalty was to their own soil, to their neighbors, to survival itself. These fighters became known as the Greens, the color of the fields, of life, of rebellion without doctrine. Across the southern plains of Ukraine and the forests of Tambov, whole regions slipped from anyone's control. The Reds sent detachments to seize grain, the Whites burned villages suspected of sheltering partisans, the Greens struck at both. Trains were derailed, convoys ambushed, commissars captured and executed in secret. At first, the Bolsheviks dismissed them as bandits, but banditry requires profit, and there was little to profit from in those barren lands. What drove the Greens was not greed but the fury of the dispossessed, the sense that every army marching through their fields was a new kind of master. In the chaos, another voice rose from the south, a voice of black banners and wild freedom. His name was Nestor Makhno, a short, sharp-eyed peasant from the Ukrainian steppe. Makhno had tasted prison under the Tsar and revolution under the Reds. Out of the ashes of both, he forged his own movement, the anarchist army of the Black Flag. His followers rode on fast horses, their banners painted with skulls and the words, "Death to all who stand in the way of freedom." They fought the whites with fury, the Germans with cunning, and the Bolsheviks with growing distrust. To the peasants, Makhno was a folk hero, a man who drank with them, fought beside them, and spoke the simple truth that no government, red or white, could ever own the people who fed it. Makhno's territory, a shifting patchwork across southeastern Ukraine, became a world unto itself. There were no landlords there, no bureaucrats, no uniforms save the black scarves tied around riders' necks. Village councils governed themselves, food was shared, decisions were made in open assemblies. For a fleeting moment, amid the ruin of empires, a kind of freedom blossomed, a freedom born of desperation, raw and fragile but intoxicating. Travelers who passed through remembered the sound of songs rising from the steppe at night, the sight of villagers dancing after days of battle, as though joy itself were a rebellion. But such freedom could not last. The whites called Makhno a criminal, the Bolsheviks called him a traitor. Both sent armies against him, yet like smoke he slipped between them, striking fast and vanishing into the plains. His horsemen appeared at dawn, sabers flashing, then melted back into the horizon before noon. For years his movement endured, fueled by peasant anger and the impossibility of obedience. When the Red Army finally turned on him in 1921, they did so with a vengeance, crushing the remnants of the Black Flag beneath artillery and fire. Makhno fled across the border, into exile and obscurity, but his legend remained the wild echo of a people who refused to kneel to any power. While Makhno's banners burned, the rest of the countryside sank deeper into famine. The policies of war communism, once proclaimed as the revolution's lifeline, became its curse. Commissars measured loyalty in bushels of grain. The villages that resisted were branded counter-revolutionary. Entire districts were punished. In Tambov, the uprising of 1,921,921 turned the soil red. Alexander Antonov, a former socialist revolutionary turned rebel, led tens of thousands of peasants against the Soviet requisition squads. They called themselves defenders of the true revolution, the one that had promised bread and freedom, not bayonets and hunger. The Bolshevik response was merciless. Tukhachevsky's troops encircled the region, using artillery, poison gas, and mass arrests to break resistance. Villages were burned, hostages taken, families deported to camps. The war between peasants and the state was fought not on battlefields but in barns and forests, among people who had never wanted a war at all. When it ended, Tambov was silent, its fields blackened, its people vanished. The rebellion had been crushed, but at a cost that could never be counted in numbers. What had died there was not only life, but faith. The faith that the revolution might still belong to the people who fed it. In distant Moscow, reports arrived in careful language. Banditry suppressed, the communiqué said. Order restored. Yet the truth seeped through like water through cracks. Letters smuggled by soldiers told of executions without trial, of children hiding in cellars while entire villages were burned to make examples. Among the commissars who carried out the orders, some believed they were saving the revolution. Others simply obeyed, knowing that mercy had become a luxury. Lenin called the uprisings tragic but necessary. Trotsky spoke of the need for iron discipline. And somewhere in the cold countryside, the peasants whispered that every banner, red, white, or black, had betrayed them. Still, life went on because it had to. The snow fell, the spring thaw came, and the soil once again demanded seeds. Women buried the dead and took up plows. Children scavenged metal from battlefields to make tools. The revolution's maps showed borders and fronts, but the peasants knew only the boundaries of their own villages, the thin line between hunger and harvest. When soldiers came, they gave what they must, and when the soldiers left, they hid what remained. Their rebellion had been crushed, but their resistance continued in quieter forms: silence, evasion, endurance. It was a war of patience now, fought in whispers instead of gunfire. The anarchists, too, survived in spirit, if not in arms. In exiles' letters and clandestine books, they wrote of those brief years when the people had ruled themselves. They described meetings held in open fields, decisions made without coercion, the sense that for a moment, however fleeting, ordinary men and women had been the masters of their own fate. Historians would later argue that it was naive, chaotic, doomed from the start, but to those who had lived it, it was proof that another Russia had been possible, even if only between storms. As 1921 gave way to 1922, the guns finally quieted. The Red Army stood triumphant, the whites were gone, the greens scattered, the black banners trampled into mud. Yet in that silence lay something more haunting than defeat: the emptiness of a countryside stripped of faith. The revolution had survived, but the people who had tilled its fields no longer believed in its promises. They had seen too much: the requisition squads, the firing lines, the endless hunger dressed up as duty. They no longer cared who ruled from the Kremlin, so long as the taxes stopped and the soldiers stayed away. Lenin, his health failing, began to reconsider. War. Communism had won the war, but was losing the peace. He announced a new policy, the NEP, allowing markets to reopen and peasants to sell their grain. It was an admission that the people's endurance had reached its limit. In the villages, markets returned cautiously, makeshift stalls beneath half-burned roofs, peasants trading flour for salt, boots for bread. For the first time in years, laughter returned to the sound of commerce. But beneath it all lingered the memory of the years, of fire. They had learned that freedom could vanish as quickly as it came. When travelers later asked the peasants which side they had fought on, the answer was often the same: we fought for ourselves. They had no monuments, no medals, only scars and songs. In those songs, the reds and whites were shadows. The true hero was the land itself, unyielding, eternal, indifferent to the flags that bled upon it. The peasants had been the ground on which history marched, and when history moved on, they remained, bent over their plows, turning soil that remembered everything. The Civil War would be remembered in Moscow as a triumph of the people's state. But in the villages, memory took another shape. Old men told stories by the hearth of soldiers who came from the horizon and vanished into it again, of banners no one could trust, of sons who never returned. They spoke of Makhno like a legend, half man, half storm, of Antonov as a ghost of justice, of comrades who had once believed that freedom could be plowed and harvested like grain. Their children listened, wide-eyed, and though they grew up under the Red Star, a faint echo of those lost years remained in their hearts. And so the countryside endured, wounded, weary, but alive. The Greens were gone, the anarchists scattered, yet their defiance became part of the soil itself, sown into the memory of every field that had burned and every mother who had buried her child. In that memory lay a quiet truth, that the greatest wars are not fought for power, but for the right to live without fear. The red banners would rise higher in the years to come, the cities would rebuild, and the Soviet Union would proclaim itself reborn. But beneath the noise of parades and speeches, in the rustle of wheat under the summer wind, the land still whispered the same ancient prayer, the one that had carried Russia through every storm. Let the harvest come. Let the soldiers stay away. Let the earth, at last, be left in peace. The Red Terror. Fear as power. The guns had quieted in many places, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of doors locked from within, of whispers pressed down beneath the weight of listening walls. The Civil War had taught the new rulers one lesson above all others, that victory, once won, must be kept. And so began another war, one without battlefields or borders, fought not against armies but against fear itself. A fear carefully planted, patiently cultivated, until it grew into the very foundation of power. The Red Terror, they called it. At first, it did not have a name. It was born in backrooms and cellars, in the damp offices of the Cheka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. Its founder, Felix Dzerzhinsky, was a gaunt man with eyes like winter steel, a believer who smiled rarely and slept little. He did not see himself as cruel, only necessary. "We stand for organized terror," he said, "because it is indispensable to revolution." His words were not shouted, they were spoken with the calm of a surgeon explaining an operation. The Cheka's offices appeared overnight in every city and town, in abandoned banks, in schools, in the mansions of exiled nobles. Their doors were marked with red stars and guarded by men in leather coats. Inside, files piled up like snowdrifts, lists of suspects, denunciations written in nervous handwriting, names passed from neighbor to neighbor. To be denounced was to vanish. Sometimes the knock came at night, sometimes at dawn. A man would open the door to a beam of lamplight and a quiet voice. "Comrade, you are needed for questioning." They called it questioning, but few returned to answer again. The prisons overflowed Lubyanka, Butyrka, the old Tsarist fortresses now painted with slogans of liberation. Behind their walls, the revolution devoured its enemies, real, imagined, or simply convenient. The air smelled of wet stone and cigarette smoke. Footsteps echoed through corridors that never slept. In one cell, a former officer recited prayers he no longer believed in. In another, a poet whispered verses to keep his sanity, and somewhere above them, the city went on as usual, trams clattering, markets murmuring, life continuing as if terror were only weather. Outside the prisons, the people learned to live with caution. Words became currency too dangerous to spend. A wrong joke, a misplaced complaint, an old letter from a cousin abroad, any of these could condemn. So, people learned to speak in layers, to smile without meaning, to listen without agreeing. In the years of the Red Terror, trust itself became a luxury no one could afford. The spark that lit it had been violence. In August 1918, two events changed everything: an attempt on Lenin's life by Fanya Kaplan and the assassination of the Bolshevik leader Uritsky in Petrograd. The bullets that wounded Lenin also wounded whatever mercy the dawn of the revolution had left. The Bolsheviks declared that the bourgeoisie must pay for their crimes in blood. Posters appeared with a single command: an eye for an eye. From that moment, fear was not an accident of revolution, but its instrument. In the countryside, the Cheka's trains followed the Red Army's advance. Each one carried investigators, typists, guards, and executioners. They called them flying tribunals. A village that resisted grain requisition would find the train at its station by nightfall. A tribunal would be set up in the local hall, trials lasting minutes. The verdict was almost always the same. Sometimes the condemned were lined up by the riverbank. Sometimes the shots came from behind the barn where they had stored their grain. The earth became heavy with secrets. To justify it, the leaders spoke of history, of necessity, of war. Trotsky called terror a weapon sharpened against the class enemy. Lenin called it revolutionary justice. In their vision, mercy was a weakness of the old world. A new world demanded new morality, one where the life of an individual meant little beside the destiny of millions. Yet even among the Bolsheviks there were those who trembled. One official wrote in his diary, "We are cleansing the future with poison." He burned the page immediately afterward. Statistics cannot capture what fear feels like when it lives in your bones. It was the sound of boots in the stairwell, the flicker of a red armband at the end of the street, the sudden hush when a name was spoken. In factories, workers turned their eyes away when comrades disappeared. In offices, portraits of Lenin were hung beside the desks, not from devotion, but from defense. To criticize was to invite suspicion. To remain silent was to survive. The Cheka grew. By 1920, there were tens of thousands of agents. They had their own courts, their own prisons, their own trains. They answered to no law but their own interpretation of revolution. Entire classes of people were declared enemies: nobles, priests, merchants, former officials, Cossacks, Even the so-called kulaks, peasants, whose only crime was to own 2 cows instead of 1. The state no longer punished actions, it punished existence. And yet, in a strange way, the terror worked. The Red Army no longer faltered. Railways ran on time because no one dared slow them. Grain flowed toward the starving cities because refusal meant death. The machinery of the new state began to turn smoothly, lubricated by fear. Even those who hated the system found themselves cooperating with it, whispering their protests only in the safety of their dreams. In Moscow, Dzerzhinsky kept his office immaculate. Visitors described him as courteous, even gentle. He drank no alcohol, smoked constantly, and believed he was serving humanity. To him, terror was not cruelty, it was purification. He once told a subordinate, "We represent not revenge, but the harsh surgery of history." The subordinate nodded, but years later admitted that the smell of the cellar never left his memory. In the provinces, terror became more arbitrary. Local commanders used it to settle personal scores, to seize property, to silence rivals. Some arrested priests for baptizing children. Others executed entire families for harboring deserters. The line between revolution and revenge blurred until no one could tell the difference. In certain towns, people said that the only way to sleep safely was to keep one's boots by the door so that if the Cheka came, you could slip them on quickly before they dragged you away. By 1921, the Red Terror had claimed tens of thousands of lives, though the true number was never known. Records were lost, names erased, bodies buried in forests or cellars without graves. But numbers cannot weigh what was truly destroyed. What died in those years was not only opposition, but imagination itself, the ability to believe that disagreement could exist, without annihilation. And yet, amid the horror, there were flickers of humanity. A guard slipping bread to a prisoner, a typist refusing to copy an execution order and quietly erasing a name. Small, fragile acts that did nothing to stop the machine but kept alive the idea that conscience still existed somewhere beneath the roar of history. Outside Russia, the world watched with a mixture of fascination and dread. Newspapers called it the reign of Red Terror, the dictatorship of fear. Diplomats sent cables filled with rumors of mass graves and secret courts. But the war-weary nations of Europe were in no mood to intervene. They had seen too much death of their own. Russia, they decided, would have to find its own peace or its own ruin. Within the new Soviet state, terror began to harden into habit. It became part of everyday governance, part of the rhythm of authority. When Lenin died in 1924, his funeral was draped in red and mourning. But beneath the hymns there lingered an unspoken knowledge. The foundation of the new order had been poured in blood. Dzerzhinsky himself followed him to the grave 2 years later, dying at his desk, exhausted. The Cheka was renamed the GPU, then the OGPU, but the essence remained unchanged. The machinery he built would outlive them all. The people adjusted. They always do. Fear became a kind of weather, unpredictable but constant. Parents taught their children caution the way they once taught them prayers. Do not speak in the street. Do not write foolish letters. Do not ask where your uncle went. The revolution had promised to free them from chains, but now it taught them how to live quietly within invisible ones. And still, they hoped. Hope was stubborn in Russia, surviving where logic failed. In tiny chapels hidden in forests, candles still burned. In small apartments, friends whispered poems by banned writers. They said the words softly, like secrets shared with the night. Some believed that the terror would end when peace returned. Others sensed it had only just begun. In time, the Red Terror would fade from headlines, absorbed into the broader history of building socialism. But in the hearts of those who had lived through it, it never faded. They carried it like a scar, not visible, but deep. Even decades later, an unexpected knock at the door could send an old man's heart racing, his hands trembling toward boots he no longer needed. The revolution had survived every siege, every army, every rebellion. But to survive, it had become something else, a state where faith and fear were indistinguishable, where silence was the only safe prayer. The dream of liberation had hardened into obedience, and the red banner that once promised freedom now cast a shadow darker than any monarchy's crown. Yet history is never simple. Without the terror, the fragile government might have collapsed. Without order, chaos might have devoured what remained of the country. Perhaps Dzerzhinsky had been right in his grim logic that terror was the surgery of history. But if surgery saves the body while killing the soul, can it still be called healing? The years would pass, and new rulers would rise. The Cheka would change names again and again, but its whisper would remain the same. In the archives that survived, investigators wrote their closing notes in neat handwriting. Case concluded, enemy eliminated. But history leaves its own verdicts. It remembers the fear in every closed curtain, the tears wiped away before dawn, the silence that blanketed an entire people until silence itself became a form of language. And somewhere, perhaps in the countryside where peasants once hid their grain, or in a city room where a widow lights a candle for the husband who never returned, that silence still lingers, a soft echo of footsteps in a corridor, a reminder that power built on fear is never truly asleep. For in Russia, the revolution had found its sharpest weapon not in rifles, not in slogans, but in the quiet knowledge that everyone, everywhere, could be watched. And when people learn to fear even their own thoughts, the battle for their souls is already won. The Red Terror ended, but fear remained a ghost that would follow the revolution wherever it went, whispering through the corridors of power for generations to come. The famine and the ashes, surviving 1921. By 1921, the war had officially ended, but the land still felt like a wound that refused to close. The guns had stopped echoing, yet hunger had taken their place, quieter, slower, but no less cruel. Across the vast fields of what had once been the world's great granary, the soil lay bare and exhausted. The people who had survived the battles now faced something more merciless than bullets. Famine had come to Russia, not as a visitor, but as a conqueror. It began invisibly, like all great tragedies. A season of drought, a poor harvest, the memory of war still etched into the crust. Earth. The requisition squads had stripped the villages bare, leaving only the faint smell of grain in empty barns. Peasants buried their seed corn to hide it, but the ground betrayed them. The starving would dig it up at night, desperate for something to chew. The rivers dried to thin threads. The fields cracked open like broken glass. The old songs of the harvest were replaced by silence, and then by the groans of hunger. In the Volga region, where the famine struck hardest, people began to eat bark, leather, anything that could fill a stomach. A mother boiled her boots to feed her children. A soldier returning from the front found his village empty, the houses abandoned, the wells poisoned by despair. The famine did not discriminate, it devoured reds and whites, believers and atheists alike. In the cities, bread lines stretched for miles, thin figures shuffling in silence through the snow, each person clutching a ration card as if it were a relic. The cards often meant nothing. There was simply no bread left to give. The government issued proclamations, sent inspectors, counted the dead, but numbers could not measure what the famine truly meant. In some districts, entire generations vanished. In others, children wandered the roads in packs, feral and hollow-eyed, their voices small and hoarse from crying. Priests who had survived the Red Terror opened the doors of ruined churches to feed them soup made of boiled weeds. The crucifixes hung above the makeshift kitchens, staring down in silent pity. Lenin himself, though ill and weakened, understood that the famine threatened more than lives, it threatened the revolution. Starving people cannot be loyal. Empty bellies do not believe in ideology. He ordered relief efforts, but the machinery of the state was brittle, exhausted from years of war. Trains carrying aid were delayed by sabotage, theft, or simple neglect. What food reached the countryside often arrived too late. For every loaf of bread that found its way to a village, 10 were consumed by corruption or bureaucracy. It was foreign help that kept millions from vanishing entirely. Across the ocean, in a country that had once fought the Bolsheviks with words and fear, an unlikely savior appeared: America. The American Relief Administration, led by Herbert Hoover, organized ships of grain and supplies to cross the seas into Soviet ports. Tens of thousands of tons of food poured into Russia: cornmeal, condensed milk, flour. In warehouses once used for munitions, workers stacked sacks of grain that bore the simple label ARA, United States of America. For the first time, foreign and Soviet workers labored side by side, neither trusting the other, but both too desperate to argue. American doctors treated Russian peasants whose bodies had been reduced to bones. They wrote of villages where the living slept beside the dead, where entire families lay in silence, too weak to bury their kin. They wrote of the sound of hunger, a sound unlike anything else, not a cry but a long, steady moan that drifted across the fields at dusk. In Moscow, the Communist Party debated whether to thank the Americans publicly. Some feared it would humiliate the revolution to admit that capitalism had fed socialism, but Lenin was pragmatic. Politics, he said, is one thing. Hunger is another. He allowed the aid, even posed for photographs with the foreign representatives. Yet even as grain flowed in, another storm brewed, one not of nature, but of spirit. Hunger is not only a physical emptiness, it erodes the mind. When people starve, they begin to dream of food, then of things beyond food: the past, the Tsar, God, justice. Across the countryside, murmurs of rebellion stirred once again. Peasants who had endured requisition and war now faced starvation in the name of the same revolution that had promised them bread. Why must we starve for freedom, they asked. Why must we die for equality? The mood, Cheka's reports filled with new words: unrest, sabotage, despair. In Petrograd, workers went on strike, demanding higher rations. Soldiers sent to disperse them refused to fire. And on an island fortress in the Gulf of Finland, the sailors of Kronstadt, once the pride of the revolution, rose in open revolt. They demanded what they called the Third Revolution, an end to Bolshevik dictatorship, a return to true Soviet democracy, free speech, and free elections. Their banners read, "For Soviets without communists." It was a cry of disillusionment that echoed across the starving nation. The Bolsheviks saw it as betrayal. Trotsky, who had once praised those same sailors as heroes, now ordered their destruction. In the frozen days of March 1921, Red Army units marched across the ice toward Kronstadt, artillery booming against the cold. The battle was short, but savage. The sailors fought with the desperation of men who knew what awaited them if they lost. They were crushed, captured, executed. The rebellion died, but its meaning did not. It was proof that the revolution had turned inward, that its sharpest blade was now drawn against itself. After Kronstadt, Lenin faced a truth he could not ignore. The country was collapsing under the weight of its own ideals. War communism had demanded too much, the people could give no more, and so he made a decision that stunned his comrades. At the 10th Party Congress in March 1921, he announced the new economic policy, the NEP. It was, he said, a strategic retreat, a necessary step to save socialism by temporarily allowing a breath of capitalism. Peasants could once again sell their grain, small markets reopened, private trade was permitted, money returned, cautiously, like a ghost from the old world. The famine, though, could not be undone by decrees. That spring, whole provinces still starved. Villagers ate cats, dogs, then each other. The newspapers were forbidden to print the worst stories, but travelers told them anyway of mothers who kept their dead children for days, unable to let go, of markets where human flesh was sold as mutton. Foreign journalists who visited the Volga called it biblical. One wrote, "I have seen hell, and it is not fire, it is hunger." Yet even in hell, people survived. They formed cooperatives, shared what they could, learned which weeds could be boiled into something edible. In the ruins of churches, icons were replaced by posters of Lenin. and beneath them, soup kitchens served bowls of thin gruel. It was not faith that kept people alive now, but habit, the stubborn rhythm of existing one more day. When the rains finally came, when the first shoots of green broke through the soil, it felt like a miracle. People wept at the sight of grass, at the smell of wet earth. It was not the end of suffering, but the beginning of endurance. By autumn, trains once again carried sacks of grain instead of refugees. The death toll remained. Uncounted millions, perhaps 5, perhaps more. Russia had survived, but not unchanged. The famine had done what war could not. It had broken the people's faith in ideology. They would follow the party now, not because they believed, but because belief no longer mattered. Obedience was easier than hope. In Moscow, the city glittered faintly again. Cafes reopened, markets bustled, the NEP men, small traders and shopkeepers reappeared, their laughter echoing through the alleys like a sound from another century. The government pretended it was progress. The people knew it was survival. Lenin spoke of breathing space. But breathing space bought with bones is a fragile kind of life. Still, amid the exhaustion, something in the Russian spirit refused to die. A poet wrote that hunger had taught the people the discipline of despair. He meant that, after all the suffering, nothing could surprise them anymore. They had seen the limits of pain, and beyond those limits lay a strange calm, the calm of a nation that had survived every imaginable death and still risen with the dawn to work the soil. As winter came again, the snow covered the graves of the uncounted. Children who had forgotten the taste of bread learned it once more. The wind carried the faint hum of trains, not troop trains, but cargo, grain, life. The famine's shadow would linger for years, shaping the minds of those who grew up in its aftermath. They learned that mercy was fleeting, that hunger was history's most faithful ally. The revolution had promised to feed the world. Instead, it had starved its own heart. But out of that starvation grew a strange strength, a kind of endurance that no enemy could conquer. When the spring of 1922 came, the fields were green again, the rivers full, and the markets loud with barter. Yet behind every laugh was memory. Behind every loaf of bread was the ghost of one who had starved. The famine had not ended the revolution, it had purified it, hardened it, stripped away illusion. The people no longer dreamed of utopia. They dreamed only of never going hungry again. Years later, when the Soviet Union was born in December 1922, its leaders called it a new dawn. But for those who had lived through 1921, the dawn was not bright. It was pale, cautious, fragile, like the first light after a long, sleepless night. They looked upon the red flag with neither faith nor hatred, only weariness. For they had learned that history's greatest battles are not won with guns or speeches, but with the simple, stubborn act of surviving the dark. And so, as the winds swept across the plains of the Volga, over fields reborn and graves forgotten, Russia exhaled. The famine had passed, but its silence remained. It whispered through the wheat, through the chimneys of rebuilt homes, through the lullabies of mothers who still counted their children twice before sleeping. It whispered a truth older than any ideology, that hunger, once endured, becomes a memory deeper than faith, stronger than fear, and impossible to forget. The war had ended, the terror had faded, but hunger had taught Russia the final lesson of survival, that to live, one must learn to endure even the emptiness of hope. The ghosts of victory, exile and memory. The war was over, but Russia was not at peace. Victory, if that was what one could call it, hung heavy in the air like smoke that refused to lift. The red banners fluttered from every city square, but beneath them, the streets were filled, not with triumph, but with ghosts. The people had survived, yet survival itself had changed them. They walked through the ruins of their own country like strangers, searching for something they could not name. In every empty house, in every silent field, history seemed to whisper, "You have won." But at what cost? The whites were gone, their armies shattered, their leaders scattered across the winds. Some died on the battlefields they had sworn to reclaim. Others boarded ships under foreign flags, carrying with them the last fragments of a world that no longer existed. In the ports of Crimea, of Odessa, of Sevastopol, the final act of the Civil War unfolded not in gunfire, but in the quiet panic of departure. Families rushed to the docks, dragging trunks and children, clutching icons and photographs, the dust of defeat clinging to their boots. Soldiers who had once commanded battalions now begged for places on crowded ships. The air was thick with the cries of farewell voices calling names that would never be answered again. Among them stood General Wrangel, the last commander of the White Army. Tall, solemn, dressed in black, he oversaw the evacuation of what remained of his forces. He had fought not just for territory, but for a vision, a Russia that could somehow return to what it had been before 1917, before the world had torn itself apart. But that vision, like the empire itself, had crumbled beneath the aggression, weight of time. As Wrangel's ships sailed into the gray waters of the Black Sea, carrying thousands of refugees toward an uncertain future, the sun set behind the burning docks. The last lights of the old world sank beneath the horizon. Those who fled called themselves émigrés, but the word could not contain the pain of exile. They carried Russia with them, not the land, but the memory. In Paris, Berlin, Belgrade, and Istanbul, they gathered in small rooms above cafes, speaking in whispers of the country they had lost. They opened newspapers with trembling hands, searching for news from home that never came. Their money ran out. Their titles meant nothing. Princes became waiters, officers became cab drivers, countesses took in sewing to survive. Yet they clung to their dignity, to the rituals of a vanished life. Tea served from cracked samovars, toasts to the Tsar, whose portraits they still kept in drawers, songs sung softly to keep the language alive. The streets of foreign cities echoed with their melancholy. In Paris, the Russian cabbies were known for their politeness, their melancholy eyes, and the way they touched their hats to every church they passed. In Istanbul, along the Bosphorus, the smell of borscht mingled with the sea breeze from small kitchens where exiled families sold what little they could cook. In Prague and Berlin, émigré newspapers printed essays and poems filled with longing for the birch forests of their youth, for the snow falling on Moscow, for the country that had ceased to exist except in memory. Some dreamed of return. They believed that the Bolsheviks could not last, that Russia would one day awaken from its nightmare. They held meetings, formed committees, plotted restorations that would never happen. But with each passing year, the hope faded. The Soviet Union was not collapsing. It was hardening, building itself from iron and ideology. The exiles became relics of a past that even history seemed to be forgetting. And yet, they endured not as conquerors or martyrs, but as storytellers. The émigré writers, poets, and musicians turned their grief into art. In the cramped apartments of Montparnasse, pianos played the waltzes of Old Street Petersburg. In Berlin, printing presses clattered late into the night, publishing books that could never be sold in Moscow, but would one day find their way back there, smuggled in suitcases or copied by hand. Their words preserved the echoes of a Russia that lived now only in imagination, a Russia of candle-lit salons, of snow-covered estates, of laughter before the war. They could not return, but they could remember, and in remembering, they kept their homeland alive in exile. For the younger generation, the children born abroad, the memory was different. They grew up hearing stories of a country they had never seen, a land described in songs and sighs. To them, Russia was not geography. It was a feeling, the scent of tea and tobacco, the melancholy in their parents' voices, the untranslatable ache of belonging to somewhere that no longer existed. They spoke their parents' language with accents, read Pushkin and Tolstoy as fairy tales. When they dreamed, it was not of return but of identity, of understanding who they were in a world that called them foreigners everywhere. Back in Russia, the story was different. Those who had stayed behind watched the exiles leave and felt no envy. Some called them traitors, others pitied them. But soon, the state made even pity dangerous. To write to a relative abroad, to mention a brother in Paris or a cousin in Istanbul, was to risk accusation of counter-revolutionary ties. Families were divided not just by distance, but by silence. A son might never know if his father had survived abroad. A mother might never learn that her daughter still lived. The Iron Curtain of ideology had not yet been built, but already it had fallen in hearts. In Moscow, the new rulers rewrote history. The émigrés became enemies of the people, parasites, nobles, betrayers. Textbooks erased their names. Streets once named after generals and writers of the old world were given new titles, new heroes. The past was painted over, its colors replaced by the red of the new dawn. And yet, behind closed doors, old women still whispered prayers for sons who had fled, for soldiers buried overseas, for a homeland that no longer resembled the one they remembered. But memory is a stubborn thing. It survives censorship, crosses borders, hides in lullabies. The exiles' songs reached back across the sea, carried by travelers and by time itself. In Paris cafes, they sang of snow and bells and endless steppe. In Moscow basements, those same songs were hummed in secret, the melody slightly changed, but the longing unchanged. The two Russias, the one in exile and the one that remained, lived apart, but dreamed of each other like estranged lovers who could never meet again. Some émigrés tried to rebuild their lives entirely, to forget. They married, had children, opened shops. They spoke the language of their new countries, took foreign passports, and yet, on certain nights, they would sit by the window and stare into the darkness, as if listening for a sound that no longer came, the sound of a distant train, the rustle of birch leaves, the creak of snow under boots. They would whisper softly, almost without meaning to, Rodina, homeland, and in that single word lived both love and loss. General Wrangel himself settled in Yugoslavia, then in Belgium, where he tried to organize aid for his scattered soldiers. He wrote memoirs, full of regret but never bitterness. He believed that one day Russia would call her children home. He died before he could see that call never came. His body was buried in a foreign church, beneath an icon brought from Crimea, a small piece of the land he had lost. Others wandered farther still. In Shanghai, thousands of Russian refugees built entire neighborhoods, bakeries, schools, churches, even newspapers. For a time, it was called the City of the White Russians, but history has a way of chasing its exiles. When the tides of war and politics turned again, they were forced to flee once more to Australia, to America, to wherever the ships would take them. The story of their exile became a story of movement without end. And yet, in all those faraway places, they carried the same small rituals. The way they crossed themselves before drinking, the way they celebrated the old Easter with candles and painted eggs, the way they told their children, "Remember who you are." In that remembering lay the quiet defiance of a people defeated in war, but undefeated in soul. For the Soviets, exile was supposed to be erasure. But in truth, the émigrés became the mirror, in which Russia could see what it had lost: culture, grace, contradictions, the old soul that could not be molded by ideology. The state may have conquered land, but memory slipped through its fingers like water. The exiles became the keepers of that memory, the wandering custodians of a Russia that no longer existed on maps but lived in songs, letters, and the ache of longing. And perhaps, in the end, they were not the only ghosts. The revolution itself had become a kind of exile from the past, from faith, from innocence. The people who remained in Russia were exiles in their own homeland, strangers in a new world that demanded they forget the old. They built the future with their hands while their hearts remained trapped in the memory of what had been. As years passed, the two Russias drifted further apart, yet each carried a part of the other within it. The émigrés kept the language alive. The homeland kept the dream of endurance. Together, though unknowingly, they preserved the soul of a nation that had survived too much to die. In the end, history would call the Reds victorious, the Whites defeated. But victories fade, and defeats transform. The real story was not written in battles or treaties, but in the quiet lives that followed the taxi driver in Paris, whispering a prayer as he drove through the rain, the widow in Moscow lighting a candle for a husband who never returned, the child in Istanbul learning to read from a torn Russian Bible. These were the true monuments of the Civil War, not of glory, but of endurance. And if one could stand at night on a quiet street in Paris or Prague, long after the cafes had closed, one might still hear it faint, fragile, but unmistakable, the sound of a Russian melody drifting through the dark. A song of longing, of memory, of home. A song that belonged to no side, no banner, no ideology, only to those who had loved a country that no longer loved them back. The ghosts of victory had no graves. They lived in the hearts of the living, in every exile who refused to forget, and in every silence where remembrance took the place of hope. The new order, birth of the Soviet Union winter, had returned to Russia, the kind of winter that silences even memory. The fields lay buried under white silence, villages half-starved but breathing again, cities blackened by soot and smoke, their chimneys whispering tired promises to the sky. After years of revolution and war, the land had finally stopped bleeding. But what rose in that silence was not peace, it was a new kind of order, hard and cold as the frost itself. In December of 1922, as snow drifted over the Kremlin towers, a group of weary men signed a document that would alter the world. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, had been born. It was not born from peace treaties or shared dreams. It was born from exhaustion, from survival, from a need to make sense of the ruin left behind. The country that once called itself an empire was now a union of republics: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian. Territories bound together not by faith in the Tsar but by the iron logic of revolution. On paper, it was a brotherhood of nations. In truth, it was a fortress built on fear, held together by will. Lenin, frail and sick, sat in his study dictating words he could barely finish, his voice cracking with fatigue. His revolution had survived the Civil War, but it had changed him and everything around him. The ideals of 1917 peace, land, bread, had withered like the posters fading on factory walls. In their place stood order, control, and the machinery of a new state. Moscow became the beating heart of a world reborn in red and steel. Committees, councils, and commissariats multiplied like veins through the new body of government. Every decision, every loaf of bread, every whisper was measured, recorded, judged. The revolution that had promised to free the people had now decided what freedom should mean. Still, for many, it was better than chaos. After years of hunger and blood, even the strict discipline of the new regime felt like mercy. Trains ran again, markets reopened, cities flickered with weak but steady light. For the first time in years, people could walk the streets without hearing gunfire. They did not ask for democracy, they asked for bread, for work, for warmth, and the party gave them just enough of each to keep the dream alive. The state took shape like a vast machine, humming with new purpose. Its gears were ideology and fear, its fuel the belief that the future could justify the present. The Cheka, renamed now but not reformed, became the silent pulse of that machine. Its agents walked among the people unseen, their eyes everywhere. Even those who had nothing to hide felt the weight of their gaze. They called it vigilance, others called it paranoia, but it worked. The memory of the terror was still fresh, and the people obeyed not because they believed, but because they remembered. In factories once shattered by war, smoke rose again. Workers sang the new songs of labor, their hands blackened by oil and soot. Slogans covered the walls: "He who does not work shall not eat." The revolution had transformed hunger into a moral lesson. Peasants who had once fought for land now faced new decrees, collectives, quotas, committees. The soil was no longer their own, but at least the plows moved, the granaries filled. They had seen worse. They had seen famine. Lenin watched it all with a mind divided. He had dreamed of a new world, but the new world was beginning to resemble the old: power concentrated in few hands, fear binding the rest. His health worsened, his speeches shorter. Those close to him began to whisper of succession. In his notes, he warned of ambition, of men who loved control more than the cause. But revolutions, once set in motion, rarely pause for reflection. They run forward, blind and unstoppable, crushing even their makers beneath their wheels. In the countryside, the peasants spoke of Moscow as if it were another planet. The radio crackled with strange words: comrade, proletariat, Soviet, while they still measured time by harvests and hunger. Yet even they felt the pull of change. Schools opened in villages where once there had been none. Children learned to read not from the Bible but from Lenin's decrees. Doctors traveled where priests once walked. The church bells, silenced or melted for metal, no longer called the faithful, but posters of smiling workers now watched over the same doorways. The language of salvation had changed, but its rhythm was familiar. The new Soviet man was born not in comfort, but in endurance. He was the child of revolution and hardship, raised to believe that suffering was a duty and that the future was worth any sacrifice. The party told him that he was free from landlords, from priests, from kings, yet he learned quickly that freedom had limits. He could praise the revolution aloud, but doubt it only in dreams. He could speak of progress, but never of loss. He could remember hunger, but not why it had come. Still, people found ways to live within this new order. In Moscow, theaters reopened, poets wrote again cautiously, but passionately. Painters painted not saints, but workers, soldiers, and harvesters glowing in the red dawn of socialism. Music returned to the streets, the songs of soldiers, of peasants, of mothers singing their children to sleep beneath portraits of Lenin. Life, despite everything, persisted. It always did. Beyond the cities, the borders of the new Union began to solidify. In the vast expanses of Central Asia, the revolution arrived on horseback and train, carried by commissars with rifles and notebooks. They spoke of equality and progress to people who had never seen a factory or read a book. Resistance flared and was silenced. The red flag rose over deserts, mountains, tundra, over lands that had belonged to tribes and kingdoms for centuries. A new map was drawn. A map that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, bound together by ink, ideology, and blood. The outside world watched in wary fascination. Diplomats called the new Soviet state a paradox, a workers' paradise, ruled by steel discipline. Western journalists who visited Moscow wrote of endless parades, of banners and slogans, of faces that smiled too carefully. Some saw hope in it, others horror. But one thing was certain: Russia had not died in its revolution. It had transformed. Out of chaos, it had forged something vast and unyielding, something that would shape the century to come. And so, the Soviet Union entered the world like a scar that refused to fade. Its anthem spoke of unity, its symbols of peace, its methods of control. The people marched beneath banners proclaiming brotherhood, while secret prisons still whispered with chains. To many, it was deliverance. To others, a quiet nightmare. But to everyone, it was inescapable. The promise of equality had become the law of obedience. The revolution that had begun in songs of freedom ended in silence, as if the country itself had grown tired of speaking. And yet, beneath that silence, life continued. Lovers still met under flickering street lamps. Families gathered around stoves in cold apartments. Children learned to read from red textbooks, their eyes wide with the certainty that they were part of something new, something larger than themselves. They did not yet know the cost. They would learn it later, when the wheel of history turned again. Lenin did not live to see it. He died in 1924, his face preserved in marble calm, his body in glass. Crowds filed past his tomb for years, whispering prayers they no longer called prayers. The man who had destroyed gods became one. His mausoleum stood at the heart of the new order, part temple, part museum, part warning. The revolution had become eternal. And so, from the ashes of empire and the bones of the old world, a new empire had quietly taken shape. One that spoke not of kings, but of comrades, not of divine right, but of historical destiny. The Soviet Union was not born from victory or peace, but from fatigue, necessity, and the stubborn human refusal to surrender. Its birth was not celebrated with joy, but with relief. The relief of a people too tired to question, too broken to resist, too hopeful to despair. Outside the Kremlin, snow continued to fall, soft and endless, covering the streets, the monuments, the graves. It covered the scars of war, the ruins of churches, the tracks of refugees who would never return. And beneath that snow, the earth of Russia slept ancient, wounded, patient, waiting for the next spring, the next dream, the next cycle of faith and fear that history would demand. The Soviet Union had been born not as a nation, but as an idea. And ideas, once born, do not die easily. They linger, they evolve, they haunt. And in the long winter of 1922, as the wind swept through the Red Square and the lamps flickered against the frost, the people of Russia stood beneath their new flag and wondered, silently, if the dawn they had been promised had finally arrived, or if they had simply traded one darkness for another. For now, they chose to believe in dawn, because in a country that had forgotten the sound of peace, belief itself was the only warmth left. The revolution's shadow, the price of victory, the banners still fluttered above Moscow, red and bright against the gray sky, but beneath them, the color of life had faded. The Soviet Union stood victorious, yet everywhere, in the streets, in the fields, in the hearts of its people, lingered the quiet exhaustion of a nation that had paid too much. The guns were silent now, but the silence was not peace. It was the deep breath after a scream, the moment when the echoes still tremble through the air long after the sound has died. Victory had brought unity, yes, but not the kind the revolution had promised. It was not born of harmony or belief, but of fear, of fatigue, of the simple desire never to go back to the chaos that had come before. The country had survived famine, civil war, and the collapse of empire, but what remained was not the same land that had dreamed of freedom in 1917. It was harder now, colder, more watchful. The revolution had devoured its enemies, and then, slowly, it began to devour itself. The people moved through the years that followed like shadows among ruins. The war had left scars too deep for time to heal. In the villages, graves outnumbered the living. The peasants, who had once believed that the revolution would bring them land and dignity, now tilled soil that no longer belonged to them. Collectivization had begun, not yet the great wave it would later become, but enough to remind them that the old dreams had changed shape. The slogans were new, but the obedience was old. Men worked the fields under the eyes of party officials who spoke of progress while counting quotas. They measured loyalty not in words, but in bushels of grain. In the cities, things seemed brighter on the surface. Markets filled again, trams rattled, and workers returned to the factories that war had left hollow. The air smelled of coal, sweat, and hope mixed with resignation. Posters of smiling laborers covered the walls, men and women who never seemed to tire, their painted eyes shining with perfect faith. But in the real factories, the songs were softer, slower. People no longer spoke of changing the world, they spoke of surviving it. The party called this recovery. It called it progress, and in a sense, it was. Children went to school, hospitals opened, literacy spread across the countryside like dawn over the frost. For the first time, the poorest learned to read, to write, to dream in words of their own. But even as knowledge grew, freedom shrank. Every book carried a warning, every lesson a message. There was only one truth, one future, one path, and it belonged to the party. The shadow of the revolution stretched far beyond Moscow. It reached into the hearts of poets, into the quiet corners of homes, into the small, unspoken thoughts people kept to themselves. In those years, everyone learned a new kind of silence, the silence of caution. Words that had once flowed freely in the cafes of Petrograd were now whispered behind closed doors. Jokes could be dangerous. Questions could be fatal. It was safer to nod, to smile, to repeat the slogans with just enough conviction to be believed. Even the night felt different. It was no longer filled with gunfire or marching boots, but with something subtler, the knowledge that someone might be listening. In the narrow streets of Moscow, footsteps echoed too loudly. In the countryside, strangers were watched with suspicion. The new order promised safety, but it was a safety built on fear. And fear, once learned, becomes a habit that survives long after the reasons for it are forgotten. Lenin, the man who had started it all, was fading away. The stroke had taken his voice, his power, and soon his life. As his health declined, the shadows in the Kremlin grew longer. His followers whispered of succession, of what would come next. Some feared the return of the old chaos. Others saw an opportunity to seize what the revolution had left unfinished. The struggle for the future had already begun before the founder of the New World was even gone. When Lenin died in 1924, it was as if an era of breathless motion had finally stopped. Crowds poured into the streets, not all in mourning but all in awe. The man who had declared war on gods and kings was now embalmed like one. His body lay in a glass tomb in the heart of Red Square, preserved against time, against decay. The revolution had turned him into an icon, a saint of a faith that claimed to have abolished saints. Thousands walked past his tomb in silence, tears freezing on their faces, not out of devotion, but out of uncertainty. They looked upon the stillness of his face and wondered what would follow. The years that came after his death were filled with a kind of strange, suspended waiting. The world had not ended, but it had not begun anew either. The people went on, day after day, building factories, sowing fields, raising children who would never remember the old world. The party grew more powerful, more confident, its grip tightening with every decree. And somewhere within that machinery, the seeds of the next terror were already being sown. The revolution had promised equality, but hierarchy returned in new uniforms. Those who spoke the loudest about the people lived behind guarded walls, their tables heavy with food, while the workers lined up for bread. Those who had fought for the right to speak freely now found their own words censored. The dream of a classless society had created a new class, one that ruled not by birth, but by ideology. To question it was to risk vanishing. Still, life went on. The seasons turned, the rivers thawed, the fields bloomed again. Weddings were celebrated, children were born, laughter returned to kitchens. But it was a quieter laughter now, one that stopped quickly if a knock came at the door. The people had become experts at balance, at living between loyalty and doubt, between gratitude and fear. They learned to hide their hearts beneath layers of caution, to smile when they must, to mourn in secret. Survival had become its own kind of courage, and yet, beneath it all, there remained a strange, quiet pride. The Russians had endured everything: war, famine, revolution, tyranny, and they still stood. They looked upon their country, vast and wounded, and saw not despair but endurance. The rest of the world might call them broken, but they knew better. A people who can suffer so much and still sing cannot be broken. They can only be changed. In the evenings, when the work was done and the streets began to empty, one could hear the songs again, not the anthems of the party, but the old ones, the ones that had survived every regime. Songs of longing and loss, of rivers and snow, of love stronger than hardship. They were sung softly, under breath, around stoves and in darkened courtyards, passed down from old to young. They carried no politics, no slogans, only memory. For memory was all that remained untouched. The people remembered not only what had been lost, but what had been endured. They remembered the faces of the dead, the sound of laughter before the famine, the color of the sky before the fires. They remembered the small kindnesses, a loaf shared, a hand offered, a word of comfort whispered when comfort was forbidden. These memories, quiet and persistent, became the true legacy of the revolution, not the speeches or the statues, but the survival of tenderness in a world that had tried to erase it. The party spoke of a bright future, of cities made of steel and light, of a new man and a new world. And maybe, in some small way, those promises comforted people. They had nothing else to cling to. But the shadow of the revolution stretched long and dark, touching everything from the way a mother looked at her child to the way a worker glanced at his comrade. Trust was scarce, truth was slippery, but endurance was everywhere. By the late 1922, a new figure had begun to rise in that shadow, a man of few words and unshakable will, forged by the revolution's fire. He did not inspire love, nor seek it. What he wanted was order, and what he would create would shape the century. But for now, in those fragile years between the war's end and the next storm, Russia slept beneath its new flag, weary but alive. In that sleep, dreams returned strange, flickering dreams of peace, of normal life, of laughter unshadowed by fear. Perhaps, for a time, some believed those dreams would come true. But history does not rest for long in Russia. It moves like the wind over the steppes unseen, unstoppable, gathering strength for the next storm. The price of victory had been paid in full, in lives, in freedom, in silence. The revolution had triumphed, yes, but in its triumph, it had revealed a truth as old as the country itself, that power, once taken, is never easily set down, and that even the noblest dreams, when forced through human hands, can cast the darkest shadows. And yet, under those shadows, people still lived, they still loved. They still hoped not for glory, not for politics, but for something simpler, a sunrise that would come quietly, without slogans or speeches, just the light on the snow and the sound of birds returning. A morning that belonged to no party, no revolution, only to life itself. Because even in the longest shadow, the dawn always waits. The last exodus, the lost generations. They called it peace, but for millions, peace was only another kind of exile. The war was finished, the borders redrawn, and yet the roads were full again of people walking, always walking. Families with no home, soldiers with no army, children with no past. The empire that had once stretched from Europe to the Pacific had splintered into pieces, and from every fragment, people fled. They fled the famine, the prisons, the fear. They fled not just a country, but the ghosts that clung to it. In 1920, the last ships had sailed from Crimea, but even after that, the exodus continued quietly, desperately, like a tide that refused to recede. Some crossed into China through the snows of Siberia, their boots worn thin, their bodies wrapped in rags. Others slipped through the Baltic forests into Finland or Poland, bribing border guards with family heirlooms, a silver watch, a wedding ring, the last photograph of a loved one. There were no more armies now, only caravans of the displaced, moving toward an uncertain horizon. The lucky ones reached foreign shores, the unlucky vanished along the way, into the frozen rivers, the bandit camps, the nameless graves along the rail lines east of Omsk and Vladivostok. For the survivors, exile became a new kind of life, a geography of memory and longing. They called themselves bezrodny, without a homeland. And in that simple phrase lived 1,000 broken stories. In Paris, the Russians came by the thousands, settling in cheap hotels and attics, their trunks heavy with memories and light with clothes. They became the city's secret heart, invisible, polite, nostalgic. You could find them in the early morning cafes, stirring sugar into their coffee, the way they used to stir jam into tea back home. You could hear them in the streets, their accents soft and slow, as if each word might lead them back to a place that no longer existed. At night, they gathered in small restaurants on the left bank, students, former officers, old widows, their laughter echoing like ghosts through the smoky air. When someone played a balalaika, people wept openly, unashamed. They wept for Russia, for the lost years, for themselves. In Istanbul, along the Bosphorus, refugees filled entire neighborhoods. Their ships had arrived at dawn, carrying thousands from the ruins of Crimea, women in fur coats worn thin by salt, soldiers still wearing their medals beneath torn shirts, priests clutching icons wrapped in blankets. The Ottoman authorities were overwhelmed. Camps sprang up along the docks, tents made from sails and banners that once bore the double-headed eagle. The air was thick with the smell of soup kitchens, seaweed, and despair. Some of the soldiers sold their boots for bread. Others joined foreign legions just to survive. Yet, even here, amid hunger and humiliation, there was dignity. On Sundays, the refugees, dressed in what remained of their uniforms, stood in lines and sang hymns that no one else understood. Further east, in Harbin, in the far reaches of Manchuria, another Russia bloomed. There were Russian schools, Russian bakeries, Russian churches. Trains arrived from Siberia carrying teachers, nurses, officers, poets, all the fragments of a country that had lost its shape. The winters there were long and cruel, but familiar. When snow fell on the wooden rooftops, some said it smelled like home. For a while, it almost felt as though they had built a small piece of Russia in the east. But history, relentless as ever, would come for them too. The children of these exiles grew up between two worlds. They spoke the languages of their new homes, French, Turkish, Chinese, but in their dreams, they spoke Russian. They learned about a homeland they would never see, from parents who described it like a fairy tale. White churches beneath blue skies, birch forests whispering in summer wind, the smell of rye bread from village ovens. To them, Russia was not a place, it was an inheritance of longing. They were the lost generation, raised on memory and absence. And as the years passed, their accents softened, their songs faded, and the dream of return became a story their children could no longer quite believe. Back in the homeland, the party called them traitors. Newspapers spoke of white scum abroad, enemies of the working class, parasites of the West. Their names were erased from records, their families left behind were forbidden to speak of them. In small apartments in Moscow and Kiev, mothers hid old letters in cracks behind walls. Fathers whispered bedtime stories about uncles and cousins who had gone away. To mention them was dangerous, but to forget them felt like betrayal. For those who stayed, exile took a different form, exile within. The Soviet Union was vast, but freedom of movement was small. The trains carried workers and soldiers to new cities built from stone and ideology, but they also carried prisoners, men and women, who had spoken too freely, believed too quietly, remembered too much. The new order had no patience for doubt. And so, even as exiles abroad dreamed of home, millions at home dreamed of escape. Yet, not all who fled carried bitterness. Some believed the revolution, despite its violence, had been inevitable. They saw themselves not as victims of evil, but of history, caught in the turn of a great wheel that crushed all who stood beneath it. Their letters, smuggled out through neutral countries, were filled with both sorrow and resignation. "Perhaps one day," one woman wrote from Paris, "our children will understand why we had to leave, and why, even far away, we could not stop loving the land that drove us out." Others turned their exile into creation. Writers and artists of the diaspora gave the world new voices: Bunin, Nabokov, Tsveteva, poets of displacement, chroniclers of memory. Their words carried the weight of loss and the beauty of endurance. They wrote not to return, but to preserve, to hold in ink what time was trying to erase. Their books became cathedrals of nostalgia, fragile, luminous, defiant. Through them, Russia continued to live, if only in sentences and sighs. But exile was not kind to all. For many, it became a slow undoing. Proud officers ended their days sweeping streets. Former aristocrats sold trinkets in markets to tourists who didn't recognize them. Old men drank cheap wine under bridges, telling stories no one wanted to hear. They spoke of battles, of faith, of lost loves, and each story ended the same way, with silence. Because no story could end differently when the homeland itself had vanished behind a wall of ideology and snow. And yet, even in this wandering, something endured, a kind of sacred stubbornness. They still called themselves Russians, even when passports said otherwise. They still celebrated Easter with candles and songs, still cooked the same soups, still crossed themselves before meals. To live, for them, was to remember. Every act of memory was resistance. Meanwhile, the new generation in Russia grew up without those memories. They were taught that the émigrés were villains, that the revolution had purged the nation of parasites and cowards. They memorized slogans instead of family names, sang anthems instead of lullabies. The past was rewritten, smoothed, purified. To question it was treason, to mourn it was madness. But history has a way of whispering through cracks. In quiet villages, an old woman might still bake bread the way her mother had before the revolution. In Moscow, a child might find a faded photograph in a drawer, a man in uniform standing beside a woman in pearls, and ask, "Who were they?" The answer would come in a whisper: "They were us, before." Time moved forward, as it always does. The émigré communities aged. The children became parents. The parents grew old. Some died in foreign lands and were buried beneath crosses carved with Cyrillic letters that slowly faded in the foreign rain. Their graves became small pieces of Russia scattered across the world, in Paris, in Belgrade, in Shanghai. Pilgrims of memory could walk among them and feel the echo of an entire nation dispersed into dust and longing. But even as they faded, their spirit lingered. They had carried Russia with them in their songs, in their books, in their hearts, and in doing so, they had kept something alive that the revolution could not extinguish. The émigrés had lost their country, but they had preserved its soul. And perhaps, in the end, that was what mattered most. Because the story of the Russian Civil War was never only about victory or defeat, red or white. It was about the millions who wandered between those colors, gray with fatigue, blue with cold, red with sorrow. It was about the people who kept walking even after history had stopped counting them. The mothers who crossed borders carrying infants wrapped in rags. The soldiers who sang lullabies instead of marching songs. The children who asked what home meant and were told, "It's a word we still remember, even if we never see it again." In the quiet of exile, when the city streets grew still and the lamps burned low, they would dream of Russia, not of its politics, nor its wars, but of its seasons. Of spring rains on wooden roofs, of summer fields buzzing with bees, of autumn birches shedding golden tears, of winter nights where silence itself seemed holy. They would wake from those dreams and weep not for themselves, but for a land that could never again be as it was in memory. They were the lost generations, not lost because they disappeared, but because they belonged nowhere. They carried their country like a wound, and yet, in that wound, there was a strange kind of grace. For as long as they remembered, Russia lived not in flags, not in decrees, but in the quiet, unbroken rhythm of the heart. And so, the exiles became eternal not by returning home, but by never letting it go. The seeds of steel, from revolution to regime. The revolution had burned bright, then dimmed to embers. Out of its fire, something new was being forged. Slow, deliberate, and hard as steel. The war had ended, the banners of the whites had fallen, and the chaos of the early years had settled into a kind of grim order. But it was not the peace that many had dreamed of. It was the kind of peace that comes when exhaustion wins, when the heart beats slower, not from contentment, but from weariness. Russia was alive, but changed, its people scarred, its cities hollowed, its faith transformed. The slogans that once stirred the masses had become commandments, carved into stone and memory. The revolution, once a movement of hope, was now a state one with ministries, parades, and prisons. And though it spoke of freedom, it built its foundations on obedience. Factories rose from the ashes of the Civil War. They called it reconstruction, but it was more than rebuilding, it was recreation. Entire cities were reimagined as engines of ideology, their streets designed to echo the power of the collective. The noise of machines replaced the sound of gunfire. The smoke that curled above the chimneys was not the smoke of destruction, but of creation, a signal that the new Russia, the Soviet Union, was learning to breathe again. In the glow of furnaces and the hum of gears, a new kind of faith began to form. It was not faith in God, or Tsar, or destiny, but in progress, in steel, in labor, in the idea that humanity could shape its own future through work and will. Propaganda posters spoke of the worker as hero, the farmer as soldier, the child as builder of tomorrow. People believed, or tried to. It was easier than questioning. The party became the conscience of the nation, vast, watchful, omnipresent. Its reach extended into every home, every school, every whisper. It offered purpose and belonging to a people who had known too much chaos. It told them that sacrifice was holy, that to work was to live, and that history was watching. Those who followed the line were praised. Those who doubted were corrected. And yet, beneath the surface, there were still those who remembered the earlier dream of true equality, of freedom that was not fear wearing a new face. Among them walked a man who understood that dreams alone could not hold power. His name was Joseph Stalin. In the beginning, few saw him as anything more than a bureaucrat, quiet, careful, a man who blended into meetings like a shadow on the wall. But he was watching, always watching. While others debated ideals, he counted men, factories, food, loyalty. When Lenin died, Stalin moved not with fire, but with patience, the patience of stone shaping water. The years that followed were a slow tightening of the world. The party turned inward, purging, cleansing, defining itself. The old comrades of the revolution, the ones who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in the storm, began to vanish, one by one, into silence. At first, the people did not understand. They were told that enemies hid among them, saboteurs, spies, traitors. They nodded, they whispered, they believed. Because disbelief was dangerous, and belief was survival. But before the fear came the building. The first great plans were drawn blueprints for a new economy, a new society. It was the age of the 5-year plans, of iron and electricity. The country that had once lived by the plow now dreamed in smoke and metal. Dams rose on rivers once sacred, cities sprawled across the steppe like machinery come alive. Workers marched in parades, their faces proud, their hands blistered, their voices singing of a future that seemed just within reach. Yet, for every worker in the city, a peasant starved in the fields. The drive to industrialize came at a cost that few could measure. Grain was seized, quotas enforced, villages emptied. Trains carried food from the countryside to the cities, leaving behind only hunger. In Ukraine, the famine spread like a silent plague. Millions gone, their fields turned to graves. The party spoke of progress, the people whispered of ghosts, and still, the machinery turned. The Soviet Union grew stronger, colder, more efficient. It was a miracle of endurance, if not of mercy. The chaos of the revolution was gone, replaced by order so rigid it felt eternal. Fear had become the mortar that held the empire together. But beneath it all, a strange pride still lived. The people looked at the factories, the schools, the electrified cities, and felt, despite everything, that they had built something powerful from the ashes of ruin. In the evenings, after long hours at the machines, workers would gather in communal halls to watch films about the future. They saw rockets, tractors, shining cities of glass and steel. They applauded, not because they believed it was real, but because they wanted to. The dream was beautiful, even if it was made of lies. Those who lived through these years learned to carry two truths, one for the world, and one for the self. In public, they cheered, marched, built, obeyed. In private, they mourned, remembered, questioned. They knew that to survive, one must master silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of endurance. And so, a generation was raised in the art of quiet strength. By the early 1932, the transformation was complete. The Soviet Union no longer resembled the revolutionary chaos of its birth. It was disciplined, organized, unstoppable. The ideals of Marx and Lenin had hardened into policy, into laws, into prisons. The revolution had turned into a regime, and the dreamers had become administrators of that dream. But the people, they adapted. They always did. They found laughter in small things, in songs sung after curfew, in jokes whispered over bread and soup, in love letters smuggled between shifts. Life persisted in the corners of the vast machine, finding cracks in the steel where light could still enter. And if anyone asked, they would say they were proud. Proud of the power that now frightened the West, proud of the trains that reached across the continent, proud of the flag that waved above every city. Pride was safer than doubt, and perhaps, after so much loss, it even felt real. The children who grew up during these years did not know another world. To them, the party was not a government, it was life itself. They learned to salute, to chant, to dream in red. Their textbooks spoke of heroes, of Lenin's wisdom, of Stalin's guidance. They believed because belief was all they had known, and for a time, belief was enough. But the older ones remembered, the mothers who had buried sons in the Civil War, the fathers who had fought for the Tsar, then for the Soviets, then for nothing at all. The old priests who still crossed themselves in secret, the peasants who prayed to the soil, the teachers who taught one lesson by day and another by night. They carried the old world like a secret flame, hidden but unextinguished. It is easy to see history as machinery, revolutions, empires, regimes, but beneath the machinery are always people, and people do not change as quickly as governments wish. They still fall in love, still dream, still tell stories. Even in the darkest years, Russia was filled with stories of bravery, of loss, of kindness in the face of fear. In one small village, a teacher continued to tell her students about Pushkin and Tolstoy even after the books were banned. In another, a blacksmith repaired his tools at night by candlelight, whispering the old prayers his father had taught him. In the city, a young woman danced in secret, because music was still the only thing that made her feel human. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of memory. And memory, in such times, was the truest form of defiance. As the years passed, the Soviet Union became both a symbol and a warning to the world. It was a nation of contradictions, brutal yet visionary, repressive yet determined, broken yet unbowed. It had replaced faith with ideology, monarchy with machinery, chaos with iron order. But beneath all its noise, the soul of the people still whispered, sometimes in prayer, sometimes in song, sometimes in silence. The seeds of steel had been planted. They would grow into monuments, into armies, into a power that would one day rival the world. But they would also grow into something quieter, into endurance, into resilience, into the strange, sorrowful beauty of a people who survive everything history does to them. And somewhere, beneath the cold architecture of this new regime, still beat the same heart that had always guided Russia, stubborn, patient, unbroken, a heart that had known centuries of tyrants, wars, revolutions, and still found a way to beat beneath it all. Because in the end, the revolution had not destroyed Russia. It had remade her, yes, into iron, into discipline, into something unrecognizable, but her spirit, though hidden, endured. Beneath the machinery, beneath the propaganda, beneath the portraits and parades, there still lived the quiet hum of something ancient, something human. And as the red banners waved above the Kremlin and the smokestacks poured gray clouds into a pale sky, the people below walked to work, to school, to home, each step an act of survival, each breath a small, silent prayer. The revolution had become a regime, but the people had become eternal. And in their silence, history itself found its heartbeat. Epitaph of a revolution, reflections on the Russian soul. The winds that once howled with the fury of revolution had grown soft now, carrying only whispers across the land. The echo of gunfire had faded into memory, the flags had weathered, the speeches long ceased to stir hearts as they once had. The revolution that promised eternity had become history, a story retold, revised, and repainted in the colors of power. And yet, beneath all that noise and silence, one question lingered like smoke in winter air. What had it all meant? In the quiet years that followed, as the Soviet Union hardened into permanence, the people of Russia began to live, not with the revolution, but with its ghost. It haunted them in songs, in old photographs, in the faces of those who had lived too long to believe in glory anymore. It haunted the silence of the fields that had seen brothers kill brothers, the abandoned churches, whose bells had not rung in a generation, the monuments built over bones no one dared name. The Civil War was over, but its spirit never truly died. It had simply changed form, folding itself into the rhythm of daily life, in the way people spoke carefully, trusted rarely, hoped quietly, in the way they loved fiercely, because so much else could be taken from them. Every family had its ghosts, every town its secrets, every generation its scars. They did not speak of them, but they lived by them. The Russia that emerged from the revolution was vast and strange, both ancient and newborn, wounded and proud. It stood like a giant waking from fever, uncertain whether it had been healed or broken. The peasants who once dreamed of owning their fields now plowed in collective silence. The workers who had stormed the factories now labored for quotas and slogans. The soldiers who had fought for the people now guarded the state from the people themselves. And yet, in some strange way, life went on. Children were born who would never know the world before the revolution. To them, the past was myth. Golden domes and horse-drawn carriages, tsars and nobles, vanished like fairy tales. They grew up beneath portraits of Lenin, under the red flags that fluttered like eternal dawns. They sang songs of labor and victory, recited lessons about equality and the triumph of the proletariat. But in their grandparents' eyes, they sometimes glimpsed another story, one too dangerous to tell, too painful to forget. The older generation carried their memories like relics. They remembered the hunger, the terror, the nights when every knock at the door could be the last. But they also remembered the strange, impossible beauty of those years, the feeling, however brief, that history itself had cracked open and that ordinary people, for the first time, could reach in and change it. That feeling, once known, never entirely fades. Even in defeat, it remains a bittersweet echo of what humanity might be capable of when desperation turns into faith. Faith, that was what the revolution had become, for better or worse. It was a faith that demanded devotion, sacrifice, even blood. It replaced saints with soldiers, crosses with red stars, sermons with slogans. But it was faith all the same, faith in a world that could be remade, in suffering that could have meaning, in struggle that could lead to salvation. And like all faiths, it both uplifted and destroyed. Those who believed with all their hearts gave everything: their labor, their art, their lives. They built the roads, the factories, the dams, the future. But those who doubted, who hesitated, who asked questions, they were crushed beneath the same machinery they had helped to build. The revolution had freed Russia from the past, only to bind it to a future that demanded obedience. It had promised paradise but delivered endurance. Still, there was something magnificent in that endurance. No other people could have survived what Russia endured, not just once, but again and again, through famine, purges, war. They endured it not because they were blind, but because they refused to let despair win. They endured it the way the birch trees endured the winter bending, never breaking, waiting for spring. And in small ways, spring always came. In a mother's lullaby sung in secret, in the warmth of shared bread during hunger, in the laughter of children who played between the ruins of old cathedrals. In those moments, the Russian soul revealed itself not in ideology or politics, but in its quiet defiance, its insistence on finding beauty even in the coldest places. Perhaps that was the true legacy of the revolution, not the government it built or the wars it won, but the resilience it revealed. It showed that a nation could be broken 100 times and still find a way to stand. That even when faith in leaders, in systems, in promises fades, faith in survival remains. The poets of the next generation wrote not about triumph, but about memory. They spoke of snow falling on forgotten graves, of rivers carrying secrets to the sea, of dreams that could not be erased by propaganda. Their words, quiet and dangerous, reminded people that history is not made only by those in power, but by those who endure it. For the millions who had died in the Revolution and the Civil War, there were few monuments, few prayers. Their names were swallowed by time, their graves unmarked, their stories untold. But they lived on, in the silence of the land itself. in the wind across the steppes, in the forests that reclaimed the battlefields, in the rivers that still ran red in the setting sun. The soil of Russia held their memory, and in that memory the revolution was eternal. And yet, eternity is a fragile thing. By the mid-20th century, the Soviet Union stood tall, an empire once again. Though it had sworn to abolish empires forever, its armies marched, its science soared, its ideology spread, but beneath that steel and certainty, the same question still whispered, had anything truly changed? Was this the future they had fought for, or merely another mask for the same old hunger for control? The truth, as always, was both. The revolution had broken chains and forged new ones. It had lifted millions from poverty, but it had silenced millions more. It had turned peasants into workers, subjects into citizens, but also humans into numbers. It had killed, but it had also created. And in that paradox, it had become not just a chapter of Russian history, but a mirror of the human condition itself, the eternal struggle between hope and power, between the dream of freedom and the fear of chaos. In the quiet of a Moscow night, when the city lights flickered on the snow, an old woman might still stand by her window and whisper the names of those she had lost. A young man might pause on his way home, listening to a song from a passing radio, an old melody, older than the revolution, older than the century. And in those moments, the line between past and present blurs. The ghosts return, gentle now, no longer angry. They come not to haunt, but to remind that every dream has a cost, that every ideal, no matter how pure, must pass through the imperfection of human hands. That history is not written in manifestos or decrees, but in the hearts that bear its weight. The Russian Civil War had ended more than a lifetime ago, but its echoes still shape the world that followed, not just in politics or power, but in the soul of a people who learned that survival itself can be a form of victory. The fields where they fought are quiet now. The statues stand in their solemn lines. But listen closely, and you can still hear it, a low hum beneath the snow, the pulse of a story that refuses to die. The revolution began with fire, with the roar of crowds, the tearing down of thrones, the promise of a new dawn. It ended with whispers, with the quiet rustle of papers, the turning of wheels, the heartbeat of a nation learning to live with what it had become. Between those two sounds, the roar and the whisper, lies the story of Russia. A story of hunger and hope, of cruelty and compassion, of endings that were also beginnings. A story that teaches us that history does not move in straight lines, but in circles, always returning, always reminding, always asking the same questions. What is freedom? What is justice? What is the price of both? Perhaps, in the end, there are no answers, only echoes. And in those echoes, if one listens long enough, one might hear the true voice of Russia, soft, weary, enduring. A voice that has sung through wars, through revolutions, through centuries of sorrow and snow. A voice that says, quietly but firmly, we are still here, the revolution has ended. The empire has changed. The world has moved on. But the Russian soul, the eternal, unbroken soul, still hums beneath it all. And as the last light fades over the frozen land, it whispers one final truth. History does not sleep. It dreams. And so, as the fires of revolution fade into the quiet hum of memory, only echoes remain of voices, of dreams, of a people who endured more than history can hold. Empires may fall, ideologies may rise and crumble, but the human spirit, it always finds a way to whisper through the silence. You are watching Lullaby of Empires, where history dreams, then he would pay it without hesitation. And blood there was, more than anyone had imagined. The Red Army became a tide, sweeping through towns and villages, reclaiming lost ground. Behind it followed the Cheka, purging dissent, rooting out spies, punishing resistance. To surrender was not safety, it was often a sentence. Yet even those who feared them whispered that the Reds brought order where the Whites brought chaos. Trains ran again, factories reopened, grain convoys reached the starving cities. The revolution, once fragile and fractured, now moved with the rhythm of command. And at its center, still, was Trotsky, the man on the train, the voice that refused to quiet. His soldiers began to speak of him in half-mythic tones. Some said he never slept, that he wrote orders and speeches until dawn, his pen scratching like a bayonet across paper. Others claimed his train could appear anywhere, summoned by crisis itself, a phantom of steel and steam. Wherever it arrived, morale surged, and when it left fear behind. To be praised by Trotsky was honor. To be summoned without explanation was death. He demanded the impossible and received it. In a land where logistics were broken, he made supply lines appear. When food ran out, he ordered requisitioning. When men deserted, he ordered firing squads. His enemies called him a monster. His followers called him necessary. The truth was both. Without him, the revolution might have collapsed under its own chaos. With him, it became something far more formidable, a state that learned how to control not just armies, but the human spirit itself. By 1920, the tide had turned. The white armies were collapsing, their leaders fleeing into exile, their dreams fading like the smoke of their burning camps. The Red Army marched victorious through the ruins they had left behind. Cities welcomed them, not with parades, but with silence, the silence of exhaustion. The war had lasted too long. Victory felt indistinguishable from survival. Trotsky's train rolled through the reclaimed lands, its wheels screeching against rails warped by frost and blood. He stepped out to address his soldiers, not in triumph but in warning. "Comrades," he said, "we have conquered the enemy, but the harder task remains to conquer ourselves." His words hung in the cold air like breath. He knew the revolution had not ended. It had merely entered its next phase. Power, once seized, must be kept, and keeping it required vigilance sharper than any sword. In Moscow, Lenin praised him, though privately he feared him. Trotsky's brilliance was undeniable, but so was his pride. The two men had built the revolution together, yet they were already growing apart. Lenin ruled by ideology, Trotsky by momentum. One saw himself as architect, the other as engine. And between them, the state they had created began to solidify, no longer a movement, but a machinery.